At some point, unable to bear the tension, So Chi-hun decisively headed to his colleagues to confess that he was leaving work early. Everyone immediately turned to him with curiosity, and realizing that the guy had already finished his day shift, instantly understood the reason for his desire to leave the office. However, one of the colleagues approached the young man and friendly reminded him that today they were expecting the long-awaited corporate party. The comrade immediately put his arm around So Chi-hun's shoulders, explaining that he simply had no right to miss this event, because without him, the fun would be completely incomplete. The other colleagues began whispering among themselves, thinking that So Chi-hun was probably planning to spend the evening completely alone, and this thought made them a little sad. However, the guy tiredly explained, if there were even a little less work, maybe he would have agreed to go to the corporate party. But the thing was that for the past few weeks, he had been working every night non-stop, and today, for the first time in a long time, he was able to leave on time. All of this was insanely exhausting, wearing him out to the limit. Suddenly, a female colleague approached him from behind and comfortingly patted the guy on the shoulder. It seemed that only she perfectly understood his pain and exhaustion. The co-worker also gently reminded, So Chi-hun, they had all been working without a single day off lately. Everyone was very tired, not just him alone. And of course, the young man was touched that the girl turned out to be the only person who understood him. However, in reality, she believed that precisely because they were all so exhausted and overworked, tonight should be dedicated to fun and drinking. In the end, the protagonist bitterly realized these two were completely not on the same wavelength with him. Perhaps the reason partly lay in the fact that from endless overtime, they had simply gone crazy. Moreover, So Chi-hun was eager to find out how it even happened that he ended up in this gathering of psychos and workaholics. Initially, the young man entered public service precisely to work calmly and rest well. Suddenly, as he was already heading to the exit of the building, the guy saw a visitor who was just entering through the main doors. This man seemed vaguely familiar to the young man. After all, this visitor had already come to their institution today. The man's appearance was extremely unpleasant, so Chi-hun hurried to politely escort him. He reminded him that he could do nothing about his situation, as there was a strict order from above. Therefore, the employee asked him to come next time. Perhaps then they could help him. Of course, the client immediately got angry, thinking that So Chi-hun was blatantly ignoring his problem. So the guy had to explain fearfully that he had no such intentions at all. The very same female colleague came up, who patiently explained to the visitor that their center was already closed for today. If he had any questions left, he could come to them tomorrow. But in the next moment, the woman covered her mouth with her palm in horror, and her eyes opened wide. The man, still convinced that So Chi-hun was blatantly ignoring him, decided that the best solution was simply to stab this impudent person. The madman began furiously stabbing the young man with a knife, believing that So Chi-hun was to blame for all his life troubles, because he could not help him. And honestly, the guy had no idea what this crazy man was babbling about. All the hero wanted was to work peacefully and rest well. In the next moment, he suddenly jumped up and with a scream surfaced from the nightmare he had seen. Breathing heavily and coming to, the young man quickly realized that he was fine. The boy's name was Ilmok, and looking around fearfully, he tried to understand. How much more time must pass before he stops dreaming these strange, obsessive dreams about his past life? At that moment, he heard the call of the uncle innkeeper, who asked Ilmok to bring water. Exactly 1 whole year has passed since that very. So Chi-hun was stabbed by a crazed visitor. However, the young man was given a second chance at life. In the end, he suddenly found himself in the body of a completely different person in an amazing world of martial arts. Fortunately, thanks to So Chi-hun's vivid memories, the boy whose body he entered was able to adapt quite quickly and without much difficulty. Moreover, this young man worked as an ordinary servant in a small local tavern. The motto of So Chi-hun from a past life, work in moderation, rest in moderation, perfectly suited Ilmok's current job. Initially, The hero thought he could work peacefully and idly forever, but it lasted only for a while. When the boy was returning with buckets to bring water to the tavern, he suddenly saw the tavern blazing with bright flames. And along with it, his cloudless future was burning to ashes. Obviously, the guy immediately ran at full speed to the burning building, even forgetting that all this time, heavy buckets of water were hanging on his shoulders. There, in the midst of all this destruction and chaos, he saw a mysterious old man in snow-white robes, who was serenely watching the tavern blaze with fire. Obviously, the guy was very panicked, not understanding why their humble inn of all places had to catch fire. The young man immediately began pouring water on himself, preparing to rush into the flames to save the unfortunate people. At the last moment, he desperately turned to his uncle and asked him to endure a little longer. After all, the boy was about to pull him out of the fiery trap. However, unexpectedly, the white-haired elder blocked his way and pressed his sharp, cold sword to the young man's throat. Of course, for Ilmok, the stranger's behavior remained a mystery. After all, he needed to hurry to save the others. However, this old man, as if nothing had happened, calmly explained that the innkeeper had long been dead. The cause of his tragic death was that the noodles in the establishment were unbearably disgusting. So the elder could not forgive that, and Ilmok could not believe that the innkeeper was really killed over such nonsense. In the end, the old man had to explain. The noodles were indeed so disgusting that he burned the place to the ground. But in Ilmok, the man saw something special. He saw that the boy did not belong among the ordinary servants. Therefore, the elder generously decided to give him a chance. He suggested that this boy become his apprentice. If he refuses, he will die here and now. And at that moment, vivid memories suddenly overwhelmed the hero about how he had almost died in his past life. Back then, he really acted strictly according to the rules, but he was still stabbed just for allegedly ignoring a client. And here someone calmly kills people over bad noodles and burns down entire taverns? However, the boy was no longer willing to tolerate such lawlessness. So he immediately shouted desperately, outraged by the behavior of this inadequate old man. The young man reminded that no matter how much he waved his sword here, it did not mean that everything would go exactly as he wished, and the boy boldly noted that he would never obey such a madman as this old man, even if it meant dying. At that moment, from somewhere behind, the old man's assistant approached from afar, a man with a black eye patch. They quickly exchanged glances, and the assistant hurriedly nodded to his master. Then, young Ilmok roared like a wild, cornered beast, ordering these lunatics to immediately shut up and return his long-awaited peaceful life. At that moment, the assistant, silently sneaking up behind the boy, skillfully struck his neck with his fingers, causing him to instantly lose consciousness. Although the boy thought he was dying this time, the feeling was completely different. A strange relief settled in his soul. However, Ilmok frankly resented it, because in his past life he just wanted to work peacefully and have the opportunity to rest fully. Yet the hero never achieved success then or now. The old man, looking at the limp body of the boy on the ground, authoritatively ordered the assistant to drag the youth away with him. When the boy came to his senses next time, he was already in a carriage that was hastily traveling somewhere along mountain paths. Startled, Ilmok immediately began looking around until he noticed a very old man patiently waiting for his awakening. In fact, Ilmok was very surprised to be alive. Since the elder was so angry about the tasteless noodles, he should have killed him after all that hysteria and shouting. At that very moment, the old man unexpectedly decided to apologize to the youth for his outright lie. It was not he who harmed the innkeeper. The real culprit was the combat union. More precisely, he implied that the combat union set a trap when the man accidentally looked into that inn and used the incident as a pretext to unite forces against him. Honestly, this explanation sounded quite implausible, but Ilmok could not dismiss the old man's words. And judging by what the boy had seen, these so-called orthodox and demonic unions were essentially just bandits. Obviously, Ilmok was extremely curious to find out why the old man lied to him so brazenly. However, he admitted he just wanted to see the sincere, true nature of this kid. He was immensely glad to understand that the boy was ready to choose death rather than become a disciple of the enemies. And the old man was very happy that his intuition about people did not fail him. When the man chuckled good-naturedly, Ilmak was absolutely certain that this person was clearly not right in the head. However, the old man also explained to the frightened youth that he simply had no other choice but to go with them. If the boy had survived near the burned-down tavern, he would definitely have told that a terrible enemy attacked the establishment. But this enemy mercifully spared him, a simple servant. After such testimony, the lad would certainly have been killed to put all the blame on the old man himself. So now the youth really had only two options left. He would either become the old man's apprentice or die. However, the old man himself warned he did not intend to kill Ilmak. The boy would die at the hands of the combat union, which would definitely find him. The hero had to be silent for a while to weigh everything happening in his head before making a final decision. He decided to first find out the master's name, and the elder immediately noticed that the tone with which the hero addressed him had noticeably changed. However, he still introduced himself. His name was Yahello. However, unfortunately, Ilmak could not recall such a name, and the old man quickly realized this. Most likely, the hero had heard his nickname. In the Central Plains, the man was usually called the Heavenly Demon, and Ilmak clearly remembered that in most martial arts stories, the Heavenly Demon is either the main hero or the final boss, a symbol of incredible martial power and the formidable ruler of the demonic cult. Depending on the work, it could be the sect of the sun and moon, the sect of Min, and so on. In short, it simply meant the title of the cult leader. The only thing all legends about the Heavenly Demons agreed on was that they were insanely strong and always involved in all sorts of dark crimes. So Ilmak absolutely did not want to get involved in this. At that moment, the old man decided to find out what kind of peaceful life the hero was dreaming of exactly, and he simply explained that he wished to live peacefully, without obstacles and dangers. Nothing special. While they were chatting peacefully, finally the assistant knocked on the wall of the carriage, explaining that they had already arrived at the place. Then, before going outside, the elder decided to find out what the boy he had stolen was called, and he introduced himself with the name Ilmak, since he simply had no surname. In the end, the Heavenly Demon calmly nodded and solemnly went outside, leading the boy with him. The young hero saw a whole crowd of people bowed in a deep bow, and the elder solemnly greeted the boy into their sect. After that, all the subordinates began loudly glorifying Yahello, the great lord of all demons, and honestly, the number of followers turned out to be much larger than the hero had imagined. Now the young man finally truly understood what it was like to be the head of an entire cult. It still somewhat overwhelmed the boy. Moreover, looking at the Heavenly Demon now, the hero felt no negative feelings towards him. He even thought that perhaps everything would not be so bad if he agreed to become the Heavenly Demon's disciple. At that moment, they finally reached the majestic place that everyone respectfully called the Pavilion of Pungam. The elder also explained, if the young man did not agree to become his disciple, then this luxurious estate would still become his new home. And now, the hero had to stay here until he made his final decision. Yahello also solemnly promised to personally deal with those vile murderers who attacked the tavern and took the life of a good man. He promised to regularly report on the progress of the investigation to the hero. The Heavenly Demon clearly understood. The innkeeper was like a second father to Ilmak, which meant his emotional wounds were incredibly deep and painful. It didn't matter whether Ilmak became his disciple or not. The Heavenly Demon swore by his sacred name that he would definitely help the boy avenge this loss. And of course, the young man immediately fell to his knees before the elder and gratefully thanked Yahello for everything, respectfully calling him teacher. Naturally, the old man was quite surprised that the hero had made such a fateful decision so quickly. However, the boy perfectly understood. As the teacher himself said, he had no choice anyway. Therefore, the young man was ready to do everything in his power not to disappoint the elder. The heavenly demon was even slightly amazed that the boy had made the only right decision so quickly. He also solemnly explained, as the head of the cult, he cares about all the followers of their divine cult. From today, the elder will assign an assistant to his new disciple. This person will teach the boy the customs and traditions of their cult. Of course, the hero immediately bowed reverently and thanked the teacher for the invaluable help, then watched him attentively until he disappeared into the distance. However, suddenly the young man noticed that the majestic elder had stopped near some girl. As expected from the heavenly demon, he did not hesitate, and immediately found a person who would take on the role of assistant for the disciple. However, this girl looked like a real star, descended from the heavens to the sinful earth. So Ilmak was extremely surprised that she would be the one to handle his daily affairs and training. However, So Chighun resolutely ordered himself to finally gather his thoughts and calm down. After all, he needed to control himself, even considering that, given his past life, he was well over 30 years old. Admiring such a young girl was simply unforgivable. At that moment, the beautiful lady gracefully approached the young gentleman to politely greet him. She introduced herself. Her name was Chin-hena, and from that moment, she would faithfully serve him. Examining the maid more closely, Ilmak tried to find a worthy excuse for himself. Considering that his current body was about 15 years old, the age difference between them was not that big. So, there was nothing improper in his thoughts. At that moment, Chin-hena politely apologized that right after the introduction, they had to get down to business. However, from that very minute, the hero had to begin serious preparation for admission to the legendary Magwan. Of course, Ilmak heard this name for the first time, so Chin-hena patiently explained. It is a higher educational institution that accepts only the most outstanding, gifted members of the cult from the age of 16. Absolutely all high-ranking members of their cult are graduates of the renowned Magwan. Considering that the hero is a personal disciple of the Lord himself, to avoid disgracing the great name of the heavenly demon, he simply must get admitted there. Of course, the hero perfectly understood. It did not sound easy at all. And besides, they had extremely little time. However, the lady gently asked the young man not to worry prematurely, after which she elegantly gathered her hair into a high ponytail. And immediately after that, Ilmak felt some pressing, heavy atmosphere around him. Chin-hena herself, bowing in a respectful nod, solemnly promised Ilmak that she would definitely make him the strongest among all who would participate in the selection. So late evening came, and the exhausting training still did not end. Chin-hena mercilessly forced the guy to do push-ups, and with each rise of his exhausted body, he had to clearly pronounce various sacred mantras. Moreover, she turned out to be an incredibly picky, harsh tormentor. The maid mercilessly did not count push-ups when Ilmak's voice sounded too quiet and unclear. Moreover, she even nitpicked about small things if the boy's arms were not straight enough when he did push-ups with such a heavy load on his back. In the end, the unfortunate hero was simply crushed to the ground by a massive stone, so he weakly lay down to rest and catch his breath. The maid only got angry at the lazy guy once and authoritatively ordered him to get up immediately and continue the training. However, the young man was already having convulsions throughout his exhausted body, so he had to plaintively explain that he physically could not do any more push-ups. Of course, Chin-hena coldly noted, he could very well overcome himself. It's not like a knife was held to his throat. Besides, he voluntarily chose to become a disciple of the head of the divine cult. Therefore, she resolutely helped the limp guy to his feet and ordered him to grit his teeth harder and continue to endure bravely. However, when Ilmak looked at the merciless girl, his consciousness was already beginning to blur before his eyes from exhaustion. In the end, he completely lost consciousness and weakly fell onto Chin-hena's shoulder, cursing those demonic fanatics one last time. However, despite the apparent dissatisfaction at first glance, Chin-hena smiled peacefully when the boy went limp in her strong arms. All because today's training of young Master Ilmak far exceeded the limits of an ordinary person's capabilities. He had a body that had never before known martial arts. The very fact that he managed to go so far only proves his body is blessed by the heavens themselves. The maid was incredibly pleased that their wise heavenly demon was able to recognize such a rare talent. After that, there was no doubt. The master deserves the highest praise and is different from all his predecessors. Soon, when the night was already deep outside, the hero finally began to regain consciousness with difficulty. He had no idea where he was, because the last thing the young man remembered was that he was training hard with Chin Henna. At that moment, the girl, carefully laying him on his stomach, continued to channel healing energy through his wounded body. Of course, the frightened hero immediately jumped back sharply, as if stung. Therefore, the maid had to calmly explain to the young master. While he was resting, she performed an important procedure called Chunganghel. This is an ancient healing technique in which pressure points on the body are filled with beneficial internal energy. However, she had not yet finished the treatment, so she asked the hero to obediently lie back on his stomach again. And Ilmak only jumped back fearfully, because this woman looked very much like some ruthless sergeant instructor. Moreover, he felt that she was eager to patch him up as soon as possible to make him train again, like a dog. But the hero, who in his past life had gone through army torments, had more than enough of such cruel treatment. Therefore, he immediately shouted desperately, trying to explain to the maid that he was not going to live in endless torment like this. Moreover, he thought that the assistant simply had to give him breaks, at least occasionally. Ilmak naively hoped that with his determination, he would still win the deserved right to a full rest. However, in the end, she calmly and mercilessly refused. The maid coldly explained to the young master. At the moment, he was only 15 years old. Only 1 year remained until the entrance exam to Magwan. He simply did not have precious time for useless rest. Of course, Ilmak was worried that his life would continue in such a tormenting sequence, and even feared simply dying from monstrous exhaustion. However, the maid had long understood. The hero was far from one who would break under such burdens and trials, and if it did happen, she would gladly follow him to the other world, and they would die on one blessed day. Even becoming a bodiless spirit, she would surely continue to serve him faithfully. In the end, the hero understood with even greater confidence. This girl was simply a true fanatic. She spoke very calmly and matter-of-factly about being buried alive together with him. Her devotion, apparently, truly knew no bounds. But in any case, her frightening words led Ilmak to one cunning thought. He was nervous, but it seemed he simply had no other way out. Therefore, the young man calmly and confidently explained. He would not argue with her words and beliefs. Partly, it was simply pointless. If so, then he would have to give up this life and everything connected with it. The maid, of course, did not understand what exactly he meant by giving up. Therefore, the hero had to frankly explain. He planned to disgrace their great teacher before the whole world, and then simply die like a miserable dog. The maid clearly became enraged by such bold words, hoping that the young master would not regret his words. However, Ilmak perfectly understood. His demonstrative worthlessness might seriously tarnish the impeccable reputation of both Chin Henna and Hyeokrayan Ilva himself. However, he considered this exclusively his problem. Of course, the girl immediately made it clear to the hero. She would not just stand aside and watch indifferently as he mercilessly destroyed their sacred reputation. Ilmak was not frightened at all by her threatening words. After all, it sounded as if in the worst case she would simply kill him. And at that moment, the enraged girl really rushed at him fiercely with her fists. In the end, she mercilessly strangled the hero, pressed him against the cold wall, and cold-bloodedly explained. He would not escape death for such bold words. If he dared to cast even the slightest shadow on the sacred name of the heavenly demon, she would personally destroy him with her own hands. Of course, those who do not know the harsh truth might consider her a heretic or fanatic. But she absolutely did not care, because she would gladly give her life for her ruler, who was also a living god. Ilmok, of course, was extremely surprised that out of all possible people, the teacher decided to present him with such a fierce heretic. At the same time, the angry lady immediately sharply threw the hero against the wall, after which she majestically stepped back, and the guy only became convinced that this bold move was still the only right decision. He perfectly realized, not only was he presented with a real heretic, but also one who was ready to kill him cold-bloodedly. The hero said all this, fully understanding. Right now, his only advantage over her was the status of being the personal disciple of the heavenly demon. He also understood, such a fanatical maid would surely have defiled the sacred legacy of his great teacher. And yet, she intended to hush up this shameful matter at the cost of his life. In fact, the hero was playing out this dramatic scene only to later cold-bloodedly use Qin Heng for his own selfish purposes. At that moment, the maid began to agonizingly wonder, what exactly was her wise teacher thinking when he took this strange disciple? And Ilmok was convinced that the fish had finally bitten the bait. So now he could move on to the next part of his cunning plan. In the end, the young man calmly explained to the maid, he never said he wouldn't train at all. He only needed two things to follow their strict rules. The first was a 15-minute deserved break every hour of grueling training. The second was guaranteed 7 hours of full sleep. And honestly, the girl was extremely surprised that these were absolutely all his conditions. Ilmok calmly and confidently promised, if she provided him with these reasonable conditions, he would train diligently with all his might. After all, he also absolutely did not want to be a burden to his great teacher. In the end, the girl agreed to his fair conditions. However, she strictly warned, the hero must truly train hard to keep his solemn word. Now that they had agreed on everything, the maid gently asked him to obediently lie on his stomach so that she could finally finish nourishing his vital points with healing energy. And honestly, the girl's voice was so meek and upset that the hero even felt a certain aching guilt for being so cruel in pressuring and manipulating her. In the end, the next day, the events moved to the training ground with the heavenly demon himself. When the majestic elder came to visit his student, he was satisfied to see that they were indeed training diligently with all their might. Ilmok was completely exhausted and sat down weakly on the ground. Qin had respectfully explained to the great lord. Their grueling training was going much easier thanks to the excellent concentration of the young master, and it seemed that at such a rapid pace, he would easily master the basics of external techniques in the shortest time. And honestly, the guy had no doubt that he would definitely succeed after a whole year of such intensified training. Without those life-saving 15-minute breaks, he would have long since died from deadly fatigue. The maid carefully helped the hero to stand on his trembling legs so that he could appear before his wise teacher in a somewhat more decent form. The heavenly demon himself came here to solemnly inform the student. Starting from this blessed day, he would study the sacred demonic arts together with him. As is known, here, in the cult of the heavenly demon, the word demonic did not carry a bad meaning at all. It embodied true humanity and mighty power that protects the common people and mercilessly punishes evil. Thus, demonic arts is the general name for all the combat techniques of the cult of the Heavenly Lord. Perhaps they differed from the heretical martial arts that Ilmok had read about in his past life. However, the guy was not going to blindly trust anything in this damn cult. Therefore, he naturally had the question, are there any drawbacks to the demonic arts? The teacher only laughed good-naturedly, completely not understanding how his student could think that there could be any flaws in the sacred techniques of the divine cult. The heavenly demon himself was convinced that their techniques had only indisputable merits, for progress moves very fast. However, the elder also honestly explained, a person may experience some side effects, so there is a certain risk of deviation. However, The man was absolutely sure. Someone like his gifted student would definitely cope with this trial. In the end, the hero realized there was no point in refusing, but it wouldn't hurt to learn in advance what side effects each type of martial art had. And the teacher, of course, generously promised to explain everything in detail to his student. Therefore, when the young man was properly dressed, the elder began his detailed story, warning that Ilmak must listen very carefully to every word. There existed the art of the explosive demonic sword, a destructive technique capable of leveling entire mountain peaks with a single strike. However, the side effect of this power is a serious problem with anger control. There was also the demonic art of ice crunch, a technique capable of instantly freezing everything around to a state of ice. The side effect is insatiable hypersexuality. There was also the art of the sword of mad souls, a sword technique significantly surpassing the 24 forms of the blooming plum with its unpredictable, deadly moves. Side effects are agonizing auditory and visual hallucinations. And honestly, listening about all these formidable techniques, the hero had no idea what to choose between martial arts and psychological disorders. However, suddenly, the young man decided to cautiously find out how many of these techniques had the great heavenly demon himself studied. But it turned out he had thoroughly studied absolutely all of them, so the hero formed a very curious impression. Despite the fact that his teachers called him the great heavenly demon, in reality the elder must have become a real walking mental asylum after all this. Noticing the student's confusion, the teacher hastened to explain that there was no need to worry prematurely. The side effects of demonic arts could be calmly overcome with proper diligence. As the hero learned, demonic martial arts are conventionally divided into 3 important stages. The first is the entry into the demon, marking the beginning of the thorny path. The second is the demon's limit, when the side effects reach their terrifying peak. And finally, when a person gets rid of all side effects, the last, 3rd stage comes. It was also called the exalted stage of overcoming the demon. Obviously, the hero was extremely curious to find out. What happens if a person never reaches the most important stage of overcoming the demon in their entire life? However, the old man comfortingly patted the student on the shoulder. He explained, it was for this very reason that out of all the others, he chose Ilmak as his student. The man reminded how carefully he had examined the boy. If the young man's heart was pure and immaculate, he would surely be able to achieve demon overcoming. However, the student still doubted that this trial was beyond his abilities. Therefore, he suggested that Ilmak choose for himself which martial art he preferred. And honestly, it was difficult for the hero to make such an important decision so quickly. However, after careful thought, he decided it would be better to study the soul-stealing sword art. The soul-stealing sword art was characterized by continuous smooth movements. They say this technique steals the very soul of the opponent, hence its ominous name. A side effect is obsessive-compulsive disorder. Of course, Ilmak perfectly understood. With moderate obsession, he could handle it without much trouble. That is why he chose this martial art. Moreover, it is better to strive for perfection to significantly increase the chances of survival in this cruel world. However, whether everything would go according to plan was still unknown. Hearing the wise choice of the student, Hyokryan Ilva suggested immediately starting training with basic stances. He would show them slowly and carefully, and the hero had to watch attentively and repeat precisely. Therefore, in the next moment, the maid respectfully brought Ilmak his personal blade, which he would wield. The teacher majestically drew the sword from its sheath, demonstrating the first technique of the soul-stealing sword art, soul extraction. However, one had to be extremely attentive, as this movement combined drawing the sword with simultaneously blocking the opponent's attack. First, the young man needed to step his right foot back, while lightning fast drawing the sword. Along the strike's trajectory, it was necessary to deflect the attack and instantly prepare for the next thrust, exactly as the mentor had just shown. Afterwards, hiding the sword back, The elder asked the youth to try to repeat this technique on his own. In fact, the explanation sounded extremely complicated, but essentially it was just about drawing the sword from the sheath. The hero saw nothing particularly difficult in this, so he confidently stepped forward and did everything as instructed. However, unexpectedly, the young man realized with horror that his sword was simply stuck fast in the sheath. He could not pull it out and ended up awkwardly frozen in place. The teacher patiently explained, the matter was not only in the hand holding the blade. He needed to carefully watch the correct angle of inclination of both the sword itself and its sheath simultaneously. As a result, after the teacher skillfully positioned the hero's hands correctly, he finally managed to draw the sword. Even the teacher himself was pleasantly surprised that the student so easily and quickly managed to catch the right angle. After that, the elder slightly complicated their training, and they began to diligently continue practicing together. Very soon, the tired hero carefully hid his blade back into the sheath. Looking at himself, he realized with surprise, perhaps because of his young age, he was indeed justifiably learning very quickly. At that moment, Yahello warned that he was about to slowly swing his sword at his student. The young man had to use the soul extraction technique to deflect his strike. In the end, despite the instant fright, the hero reacted quickly enough. He instantly armed himself with his blade and immediately skillfully parried the old man's strike. And honestly, the teacher was pleasantly surprised by his skill and enthusiastically suggested continuing the training. Only then did Ilmak realize, although he had not properly practiced this move, he blocked the strikes as if instinctively, at the reflex level. Therefore, he himself began to sincerely believe that he might be a true genius of this amazing world. In the evening, the teacher solemnly congratulated the boy on successfully mastering the basics of soul extraction. And of course, Ilmak immediately bowed reverently, thanking the teacher for such a kind compliment. Only then did the boy look at his trembling whole body and could not believe that everything happening to him was reality. The teacher's last strikes were so fast that the young man barely managed to keep up with them. However, he still blocked every strike without the slightest delay. Before leaving, Yahello also explained, the remaining time they had today, he would dedicate to training in working with internal energy. After that, he sat the young man on the ground and majestically sat behind his back himself. He explained to the boy that he had started his path too late, so Yahello decided to personally help with energy manipulation. From this moment, his internal energy would flow through the meridians according to the technique of the soul-stealing sword art. Ilmak must not miss a single sensation. He had to watch the flow of energy with utmost attention, and the feeling was indeed very strange, unusual, as if something was awakening in the boy that he had never experienced before in his life. The teacher's internal power was soft, but incredibly mighty. Also, thanks to this invaluable lesson, he was finally able to feel the flow of internal energy and the arrangement of his own meridians. The teacher finished passing the healing energy through the boy's body and solemnly congratulated him on entering the path of the soul-stealing sword art. And Ilmak sincerely rejoiced because he managed to form an energy core the size of a small bean. But at the end, Yahello strictly warned, now that the student had entered the demon limit, he must train diligently and relentlessly strive to overcome it. And since the boy had made excellent progress today, he could have dinner together with the other students. The elder warned. Everyone would gather in the main hall. It was just the right time for them to get to know each other better. So the hero respectfully promised that after washing, he would immediately come to the main hall to greet everyone. Only after the teacher left did Ilmak anxiously worry, realizing that he would meet people who would inevitably become formidable rivals in the future. Chin-hen, however, did not understand the hero's worries at all and went to help him with preparations. With her calmness, she reminded the young man, after all, he would still have to fight for the sacred place of the heavenly demon, although he wanted to live quietly and peacefully. While they were returning, Ilmak began to ask Lady Chin-hen about the art she herself had studied, and it turned out she had mastered the art of ice crunch. So, hearing this, the hero quickly understood why frost sometimes appeared around her. Only then did he begin to recall the side effects that the teacher had reported to him. However much Ilmok looked at the girl, there was a persistent feeling that she had not succumbed to this side effect at all. After that, they entered the bathhouse, where Chin Hen helpfully assisted the boy in washing. He was already gradually getting used to it. However, he was still embarrassed that the lady had studied precisely the art of ice crunch. As is known, the side effect of this technique is insatiable lust, and the hero vividly imagined what would happen if the girl suddenly gave in to this insidious side effect. However, it seemed to him, in that case, the relationship between them would become even more interesting and unpredictable than before. As if overhearing the rebellious thoughts of the guy, Chin Hen at that very moment doused him with a bucket of icy water. Deeply insulted, the maid coldly explained, "The side effects of the art of icy crunch entirely depend on who practices it." Intrigued, the hero couldn't resist and decided to find out in more detail what exactly is the side effect that appears in women. It turned out to be much more prosaic. When a woman or man's internal energy intensifies, the mind begins to work significantly faster. That is, practitioners start thinking much more cold-bloodedly than before, as if ice had bound the very soul. Of course, the hero was pleased by the absence of any other sinister side effects. Compared to other demonic arts, this seemed surprisingly mild and harmless. However, Chin Hen calmly clarified, people who practice this path gradually lose their ability to empathize and feel compassion until it completely disappears. In other words, they can partly be compared to real psychopaths. However, the girl herself was convinced this was not a side effect at all, but rather a secondary one. After all, this martial art was originally created precisely for the merciless punishment of heretics. In any case, Ilmok had to apologize to the lady for the unfortunate misunderstanding. Apparently, when she grabbed him by the throat, it was not an empty threat. The woman really wanted to kill him. This meant only one thing. He should be much more careful with this cold-blooded assistant. Finally, after Ilmok composed himself, it was time to appear at the communal dinner. This was truly the most important moment, literally the beginning of his new path. If one believes the words of Chin Henna, Ilmok became the 8th disciple of the Heavenly Lord. However, half of his predecessors tragically died, either from the side effects of cursed techniques or in bloody clashes with righteous sects. Of all the disciples, only 4 remained alive. Therefore, the survival rate of the disciples was about 50%. Obviously, the hero understood perfectly well. Surviving would be extremely difficult for him. However, the young man was mentally prepared for this. He believed he could handle any trials. Therefore, as soon as he stepped over the threshold of the hall, Ilmok immediately bowed respectfully. He introduced himself as a junior disciple, greeting the master and the senior brothers in arms. The master, smiling broadly, asked Ilmok to come closer. Then he ordered his disciples to properly greet the younger brother. After all, he was the youngest disciple in all recent years. Right then, from the opposite side of the hall, the hero heard a booming, thunderous laugh. It was the eldest of the brothers, the one who mastered the art of the bloody demonic sword. The man with a wide smile greeted the junior. Ilmok immediately remembered. A side effect of his martial art was uncontrollable rage, and not ordinary anger, but true, all-consuming fury that clouded the mind. Fortunately, the elder brother unleashed this destructive rage exclusively on the masters of the Central Plains and corrupt officials. Having received the ominous nickname Mad Demon, he became the #1 enemy of the entire martial arts world, and thus managed to avoid the demon limit of the art of the bloody demonic sword. The important thing was that he only escaped the demon limit, but never reached the overcoming. This meant the elder brother could explode at any moment. Essentially, he was like a time bomb ready to go off at any second. Of course, Ilmok immediately bowed. For him, it was a great honor to meet the elder brother, and even though he was smiling, the hero remained on guard, understanding. He still did not know what to expect from his brother. However, fortunately, the meeting with the elder brother went smoothly, and Ilmok managed to calm down a bit. After all, the atmosphere among the disciples of the heavenly demon was not so oppressive. Moreover, the hero understood. His third brother should be closer in age to So Chi-hun from his past life. This meant it would be much easier to find common ground with him. So the guy immediately bowed to this brother as well, greeting him. However, when the young man turned around, he realized with horror. This upstart threw chopsticks at him, almost piercing his head. And all this just because Ilmok decided to greet twice. The hero had a strong feeling that the brother seriously wanted to bury him on the spot. This young man possessed the martial art 14 Shadow Strikes, a fast and crazy sword technique created exclusively for killing. The name spoke for itself. The side effect: everything is perceived exclusively in a negative light. In other words, paranoia incarnate. Moreover, as was known, the third brother had already reached the demon limit. This meant only one thing. The hero could not escape this trial. At that moment, So Winfian was indignant that Ilmok dared to greet him twice, as if he was already saying goodbye to him, like a dead man. Threatening the young man with chopsticks, he demanded an explanation. Why did the hero not greet him just once? However, Ilmok perfectly understood. If he had not greeted his brother a second time, he would have gone mad because of it. But an excuse still had to be invented, and urgently. Although the boy was worried, because whatever he said, his brother could still take it the wrong way. However, unexpectedly, another one of the brothers approached. He calmly took the chopsticks from the third brother and asked him to stop joking around. The man thought that perhaps the third brother was made too sensitive by hunger, and handed him new chopsticks. After the intervention of one of the older brothers, the third brother calmed down for a brief moment, and even began to apologize for his wild behavior. Ilmok, bowing, apologized to his brother for not knowing the rules of etiquette. The young man did not want to offend him. After the problem with the third brother was resolved, the hero was finally convinced everyone in this cursed place was completely crazy. However, looking at one of the brothers who came to his aid, it seemed perhaps he was the only sane person here. It was his sixth brother, the calmest of them all. The sixth brother grabbed the hero by the shoulders and began to lead him aside, understanding. Now there was no time to delay, because there were still those whom the youngest had not greeted. After that, he led the hero to an empty chair to greet the fourth brother. Then he began to talk animatedly to an empty space, laughing at his brother's jokes. And Ilmok literally froze like a statue, completely not understanding what this person was even talking about. And most importantly, with whom, a few days before this meeting, the hero learned. The fourth brother tragically died in a fight with righteous sects, and only now did Ilmok finally remember the name of the sixth brother's art. Sword, driving the soul mad. The sixth brother himself sincerely did not understand why the youngest of the brothers just kept standing like a pillar. After that, he strictly ordered that he not insult their fourth brother and immediately greet him properly. Then the hero fully realized the terrible truth. Sword, driving the soul mad, had side effects in the form of hallucinations and voices. Therefore, it was true schizophrenia. At that moment, looking at the sixth brother, the elder burst out laughing, understanding. The sixth missed the fourth brother very much, and he immediately realized after these words that, it seemed, he had forgotten again. After all, the fourth was no longer alive. Meanwhile, their teacher only smiled peacefully, looking at his students. He was happily pleased to see such brotherly care, and Ilmok could only worry, trying not to show that this meeting was originally a failed venture. Soon, the hero finally sat down at the table, literally starving. He naively assumed that when he came here, a whole banquet awaited him. After all, since they held a meeting in his honor, they should at least have fed him properly. Just as the young man was about to pick up his chopsticks to finally eat, the heavenly demon began asking his students about their progress. In the end, the hero had to put down the sticks. After all, eating at such a moment would have been a gross breach of etiquette. At that moment, the elder brother was saying that in the area he inspected, everything was quite calm. While they were talking, Ilmak mentally prayed for them to finally start eating. After all, as is known, even a dog should not be disturbed during a meal. However, these people were working even during dinner. At that moment, seeing the younger brother's pensiveness, the elder thought, perhaps he did not fully understand what was being discussed. He generously promised to explain everything, since sooner or later, Ilmak would also have to participate in meetings and family affairs. And of course the hero promised to listen carefully to the elder brother, although in reality, he simply had no choice. That is how he learned. In their cult, the heavenly demon and his disciples periodically conduct inspections. During the last one, the master visited a tavern he liked, where the hero happened to be by chance. For his safety, the master had to return to the cult earlier than planned. Therefore, to hear the reports of the disciples who completed the inspection and to introduce the younger brother to the elder brothers, the master specially arranged this meeting. So, obviously, the hero had to be as interested as possible in what was happening. At that moment, unexpectedly, the heavenly demon decided to find out what the hero himself was thinking now. He was extremely curious about the opinion Ilmak had formed regarding the discussed problem. Did he like it? Was he satisfied with how their cult cared for the common people? After all, Ilmak was an outsider, a fresh perspective. Therefore, everyone was interested in knowing his opinion. Perhaps the young man even had suggestions on how they could improve current affairs. Ilmak was very worried. Understanding. His older brothers, like everyone here, had one eternal goal. For power, they would not hesitate to draw the sword. However, So Chihun was completely different. Let them fight among themselves as much as they want. Ilmak planned simply to enjoy life at his own pleasure. Of course, fanatics like Chinhena would not leave him alone. Therefore, from today, he needed to completely disappear from the radar. He must not show any interest in the post of cult leader. No ambitions. In other words, he will become an eternal middle manager. For this, it is better to seem slightly dull. Not too smart and not too outstanding. Just an overly eager rookie, full of enthusiasm. Well, not completely clueless, but always missing something for success. He will be the one who works hard, but rarely achieves any significant success. He must put in colossal effort, but the results, practically none. Thus, he will become what they call an honor student loser. Fortunately, the hero already had the perfect answer for this role, a tiresome system of shirking responsibility. In the end, he explained thoroughly. In his humble opinion, first of all, it was necessary to introduce a strict system of responsibility and standardized report forms. The management must check the reports, and the subordinates should only unquestioningly follow orders. This way, the senior brothers will not have to run errands personally. Secondly, it was required to divide the work into narrowly specialized tasks, but periodically rotate the apprentices across regions and departments. Otherwise, if one stays in the same place for too long, corruption inevitably begins, eating away the system from within. Thanks to regular rotation of positions and regions, they will not allow apprentices to collude with local authorities, and with a clear structure of responsibility, the transfer of affairs will not become a problem. In such a scenario, rotation will not create any difficulties at all. These two measures, in his humble opinion, perfectly complemented each other in a unified system. In fact, the hero was well aware. There was not a shred of common sense in his words. The division of departments and endless reports. That is the root of all irresponsibility. Work will be stalled while papers crawl through the instances. Reports coming from above will only become a convenient excuse to shift blame onto others. In the case of rotation of affairs, it is necessary to appoint those who will explain all the subtleties during the transfer of authority. Obviously, a person will not be able to grasp the problem just by listening to old reports. This is in the best case, if the predecessor leaves anything at all. After all, even this may not happen. Therefore, it was an absolutely useless piece of advice. with the help of which the hero was going to brand himself as a naive novice. Now surely everyone thinks his enthusiasm runs ahead of common sense. However, for the sake of a future life in peace, he was even ready to get a slap on the head. So when his older brother approached him, Ilmok closed his eyes, preparing for the worst. However, he only patted him on the head like a small child. After that, he joyfully told the teacher their youngest turned out to be much more clever than one could have expected. He even took into account the possibility of collusion among the leadership, a system that, given the doctrine of their cult, looked quite impressive. Even the heavenly demon himself was pleased to hear Ilmok outlining the improvement of his approach. The old man felt that the side effects of the art of soul abduction were already making themselves known. He was incredibly pleased that his student, without having properly trained in martial arts for even a day, already possessed such a sharp mind and political intuition. In the end, he decided to call Ilmok to him later to discuss his vision in more detail. Then the older brother suggested ending the talks about work, instead, to drink and rest properly. Already at home, the hero began to reflect on the Korean system of bureaucracy. She was hopelessly outdated. However, compared to the chaos of the martial arts world, she literally looked like a model of order. As he later learned, there was no management system at all in the divine cult, only madness. The heavenly demon's order was absolute, and that was it. In the end, Ilmok misjudged the situation, which caused him to make a major error in his calculations. In the morning after breakfast, the hero decided to go out for a short walk to get some fresh air, although Chin Hen persistently asked him to return before the start of the external training sessions. Already on the street, Ilmok was inwardly indignant. After all, even though his schedule was already packed to the brim, now he also had to study the doctrine. In such a crazy situation, he really wanted to find something quiet to calm his soul. However, unexpectedly, while he was walking, the young man saw a fragile female silhouette looking around the forest. When the girl turned around, she gave the hero a focused and even slightly confused look, like a frightened fawn. However, since Ilmok was already in his 30s, he was clearly not someone who could be embarrassed by some cute child. Moreover, it was clear the girl was scared by the appearance of a stranger. The main thing was to calm the little one in an adult way. So Ilmok began to think about how it would be best to behave. Approaching closer, he decided to gently ask the little girl what she had forgotten here. She began to try to come up with an explanation for herself. However, in the end, she realized the futility of the idea and simply pointed the hero somewhere into the distance. There, on a stone in the middle of the stream, lay a three-eyed doll, which she could not reach. Therefore, rolling up his sleeves, Ilmok rushed forward and asked the girl to trust him. Of course, the little girl fearfully tried to warn the hero. The water there was very deep, and indeed, he took only one step and already went under the water head first. However, no matter what, he could swim. So very soon, although soaked to the skin, the girl got the doll back. Initially, Ilmok just wanted to seem cool. However, it seems there was nothing cool about how he floundered in the water. The girl was still immensely grateful to the hero for helping her get that doll. Ilmok just patted the little girl on the head, glad that he got wet for a good reason. She really was happy. After that, the girl said, she was here because she was playing with the doll. At home, no one wanted to play with her. Everyone only kept saying that she needed to train, and Ilmok perfectly understood the little girl, because he was in exactly the same situation. In the end, Ilmok introduced himself, after which he decided to find out the name of this little girl. The little girl's name was Senna. In the end, Ilmok suggested to the girl to meet here tomorrow at the same time and play together. However, after recalling his crazy schedule a little, he realized the best time is lunch. They could meet at lunch and play together so she wouldn't be lonely. She was very surprised by the hero's words, so she decided to get a promise from him, and Ilmok sweetly promised they would meet every day at this time to play, after which they exchanged promises on their pinkies as a sign of an unbreakable vow. Some time passed. Chinhena noticed Ilmok had been in a cheerful mood for the past few days. She thought perhaps something good had happened to the young master, which she did not suspect. The hero tried to justify himself. He was happy that his studies were going very well. At this pace, he would master the doctrine in half a year, and the maid understood. The young master was indeed right, and Ilmak did his best to pretend that this was the only reason for his joy. Nothing else. Really. In fact, the hero felt a burning guilt for having to lie. However, if Qin Hen found out the truth, she definitely would not have allowed him to continue seeing little Senna, and she literally embodied his short, precious time for rest, which he had to protect at all costs. Moreover, this previously unknown girl really became an important part of his life, like a younger sister. Suddenly, during training, the heavenly demon himself appeared to these two with good news. Of course, both immediately bowed to greet the Lord of 10,000 demons. The man admitted to the hero his previous idea was indeed very good. However, it was somewhat detached from the realities of their cult. Therefore, he asked Ilmak to inspect their cult with his own eyes and suggest some improvements. No matter how well the training went, if he spent too much time on it, it would even be harmful to his body. And the hero was grateful for these wise words of the teacher. Moreover, he realized he still had much to learn. In the end, the teacher immediately suggested that the hero set off on the road tomorrow. He also asked Ilmak not to worry about his training. He could take Qin Hen with him to train on the way, not falling behind schedule. After that, the teacher suggested the hero study the levitation step technique today. Since time was short, he could not fall behind. And honestly, the guy missed little Senna very much. At least with her, he didn't have to train. At that moment, the girl herself was on the training ground until Madam Mother approached her. She ordered the girl not to wander and finally to focus on the task. Immediately after that, apologizing, the little girl began to hone her strikes. The mentor, looking at her, wanted to say something. However, in the end, she fell silent and left. But she asked the little girl to continue training until she returned. Only after the woman disappeared from sight did she manage to show all the emotions overwhelming her. She blamed herself greatly for almost breaking the tradition without even noticing it. Now was the most important time to make the girl stronger. Therefore, it was necessary to endure a little, because showing softness in her upbringing wasn't allowed now. Meanwhile, as the little girl trained, her nails suddenly grew, turning into animal claws. And at that moment, standing on the training ground, all she could do was remember her older brother Ilmak. The hero, on the next day, as the teacher commanded, set off on a journey together with Qin Hen. And honestly, he felt uneasy. After all, the day had flown by too quickly. Moreover, he hardly had time to warn Sen about everything. If he had known where she lived, he would have at least left a note. Ilmak mentally apologized to the girl and promised he would return soon. She just had to be patient a little longer. At that moment, suddenly another young man appeared before them. He introduced himself, explaining that he had been assigned to guard the young master during the journey. After that, another fighter approached. His face was hidden behind a mask. These two were guards who, bowing, respectfully greeted the young master. And honestly, Ilmak was surprised that the teacher had introduced people to him. This meant the teacher himself would not be traveling with them. It was even pleasant, because then he could pretend to be inspecting everything, but actually rest. He even decided to buy a gift for his younger sister during his journey. However, he did not know what children might like in the world of martial arts. However, unexpectedly, just as the hero was about to sit in his place in the carriage, Qin Hen stopped him. There was no place for him in the carriage. He had to run alongside her for the entire journey. Of course, for the guy, it was a real shock. It even seemed that the lady was joking with him. However, in the end, the carriage really started moving forward, and Ilmak had to run, trying to catch up with it. Ilmak was insanely angry, not understanding what the girl was doing. However, she considered it an excellent part of the training. Moreover, literally yesterday, the hero studied the light step technique together with the heavenly demon. Now he had to keep up with the pace of the carriage using exactly this technique. Besides, the girl immediately noticed right now the hero's lower back was horribly curved. He needed to concentrate, and in any case, keep his back perfectly straight. Now the hero was allowed to rest only during breathing exercises, and not a minute more. In the end, he ran continuously until evening, until Ilmak was completely exhausted and collapsed dead on the cold ground, as if cut down. In this incredible way, he got from his pavilion to the very county of Kutz, losing consciousness right on the frozen ground. The hero perfectly understood one bitter truth. He had hoped that in this long-awaited journey, he could finally rest a little from endless training. However, rest because of Chin. Henna was obviously terrible, even worse than usual sessions. Even when he did breathing exercises, he did it in the shaking carriage, barely able to calm the raging internal energy. And this was called rest. Chin Henna, lifting the exhausted hero from the ground, graciously praised him for his worthy efforts. Now she kindly offered to immediately proceed to cleansing and meridian exercises, and she also warned the young master he still had lessons on doctrine. They would start exactly in 1 hour. Until then, the hero needed to prepare all the study materials for their lessons. The day ended, and the next day came, resembling the previous one like 2 drops of water. They, along with their escorts, went wandering around the district and inspecting the cult's holdings. And in fact, inspecting the village was much more pleasant than all those exhausting trainings. However, Ilmak still completely did not understand. Why should they even care about improving the demonic cult? Moreover, if he put in more effort, he would have even more work in the future. Therefore, even if something brilliant came to his mind, he decided to pretend to be a fool until the very end. At that moment, the maid became extremely curious about what the young man thought of this place. At first glance, Ilmak thought this was a fairly peaceful, quiet village, and he decided to cautiously find out what the local followers mainly did here. It turned out that usually the local followers only did one thing: drove away bandits or marauders. But since they were near the cult's headquarters, there were almost no robbers here. Mostly they helped ordinary people with small, everyday problems and spread the sacred teachings. In the end, after a long walk, the hero decided to sit down to rest and have a little refreshment. Then Chin Henna dispassionately informed Ilmak, from tomorrow they will act strictly according to the schedule. Until they find what exactly to improve, they will have to travel all over Xinjiang. It turned out the next village was more than 1,000 li from here. This meant the hero could get plenty of training in running. Of course, the frightened guy immediately grabbed Chin Henna by the sleeve, begging her not to rush to conclusions. At that very moment, a truly brilliant idea came to his mind. What exactly could be improved? And of course, the assistant decided to find out what that idea was in order to appreciate it properly. However, instead of a direct answer, the hero asked to bring him a brush, ink, and paper so he could illustrate everything clearly. In fact, the hero had a whole couple of ideas. They were just not very suitable, considering the crazy rules in the cult. This meant he would not be able to implement even 10% of his own plan, and everything he proposed already looked much better than doing absolutely nothing. However, even after everything was written, the plan looked not quite finished, incomplete. Moreover, possibly, this plan could give rise to new, unforeseen problems. Therefore, he decided to use what he had written as a basis for the rest. Chin Henna herself was extremely surprised that the hero had written so much after observing for only half a day. Even the interested guard noted the rumors about the young master's brilliant mind were absolutely true. Initially, the guard thought that the situation where the young master proposed a reporting system was just a coincidence or rumors. However, now, looking at the boy, he no longer doubted the sharpness of his mind. However, the second guard who approached in a mask coldly remarked, "A large number of ideas is not always a sign of something good. After all, ideas must bring real, tangible benefits to the cult. Otherwise, they were completely useless. A waste of time." Of course, the comrade thought that his secretive friend was too serious and picky. However, he was telling the pure truth, and basically, the lady also fully agreed with him. The fact that there are many ideas does not mean that all of them are good and applicable. However, the young master Ilmok was completely different. She believed in him unconditionally. After all, when it came to rest, the young master did not back down from anything, and that was his true driving force. The next day, as if nothing had happened, they continued their journey along the planned route. Chinhena carefully examined the plan written by the hero, reading each line attentively. However, that one turned out to be truly excellent, well thought out. As the young master said, they didn't even need to continue traveling. After all, the heavenly demon would surely be extremely pleased with the written content of this letter. However, Ilmok himself suddenly realized his plan still lacked one crucial element. He was still not perfect, not complete. He was even frightened when he said it aloud. So he thought, perhaps the side effects of the soul-stealing sword had already begun to manifest in him, this obsession with perfection. However, it seemed impossible to him, because his main sacred goal was rest, not perfection. As soon as he thought about rest, he immediately remembered little Sena. To spend more precious time with her, he didn't need to work so much. However, suddenly, Lady Chinhena felt something wrong in the air. So she asked the hero to freeze and not move. She carefully opened the carriage door slightly to cautiously peek outside. There she saw a whole horde of mounted bandits rushing towards the carriage. Although to ordinary bandits, these people were too organized and disciplined. So Chinhena thought they might be deserters from the army. The guards had already noticed them and began planning how to destroy them with one powerful strike. So Chinhena warned the hero. All they needed to do was quietly observe from the side, without interfering. However, when she looked at the young master, his strange smile made her truly worry. Soon the bandits surrounded the cart from all sides, not allowing it to move even a step further. After that, they began to confer, and decided to kill the men and sell the women into slavery. However, the enraged leader immediately struck the insolent man on the head as punishment for his dishonorable words. He reminded them their original goal was never to stoop to the level of bandits. There must remain at least a drop of conscience in them. Therefore, he ordered the warriors to be careful and ensure that no innocent person was harmed. After that, the leader calmly, almost apologetically, explained, "They do not want unnecessary bloodshed. They are not seeking it." Therefore, he asked these people to give up all the valuables they had. Then they would spare their lives. After all, although robbing people was pitiful and dishonorable, unfortunately, he could not allow his brothers to starve. All he wanted was to continue living with dignity, as it had been until now. But at that very moment, two guards suddenly dashed towards the attackers, with their drawn blades gleaming in the sunlight. However, unexpectedly, Ilmok flung open the cart door and loudly ordered the guards not to kill these people. In the end, at the last moment, the warrior sharply stopped, which prevented him from cutting off the leader's head, only slightly wounding him. After that, a real slaughter began, a brutal fight. However, Chinhen clearly did not understand what the hero had planned and whether it was necessary to take such a great risk for it. Still, she perfectly understood. These two warriors accompanying them could easily handle ordinary bandits. Therefore, she completely did not understand why they needed to be spared. However, Ilmok asked her to just be silent and patiently wait. These people, whom they had just defeated, were supposed to be the decisive stroke in his plan, the last missing detail. Very soon, the commander of the attacking bandits began to slowly regain consciousness. Already at night, in the forest illuminated by moonlight, however, he realized his body did not move at all. Probably, the reason was that pressure was applied to his acupuncture points, paralyzing his body. Ilmok, calmly approaching the man, politely greeted him by name. Han Gen. Of course, he was scared to death, not knowing how Ilmok had managed to learn his name. However, it was not so difficult to find out. His soldiers told the hero everything necessary. It was only necessary to ask politely. They were not even particularly harmed. It was just that these warriors turned out to be very fond of beautiful women and tasty food. Moreover, As Ilmak heard from these people, the leader himself had a rather tragic, unfair fate. A boy younger than him received a rank higher than Lord Han himself, thanks to his connections at court. Despite the fact that he tried not to give up and to fight, he was still accused of embezzlement of state funds. In the end, the gentleman barely managed to avoid execution with his loyal men, and he found himself in the lands of the demonic cult. And if he had tried to join the demonic cult squad, he would have been rejected as a former soldier. The man had no idea what this mysterious young man was hinting at. However, the hero, as if nothing had happened, calmly offered him to serve the heavenly demon and the demonic cult. Of course, Ilmak did not look sufficiently impressive and authoritative, but he was still the personal disciple of the heavenly demon himself, and Mr. Khan was perfectly suited for one important task that he had planned. Therefore, the young man asked the leader to obey him, and then his crimes would be wiped off the face of the earth and help him officially join the cult. He could do this at least for the sake of his people, who risked their lives following him. Surely the leader himself would prefer to work together with them, not ashamed of his work and not hiding in the forests. The old man himself was extremely curious. What did Ilmak see in him that made such a generous offer? Not even fearing possible betrayal in the future. However, Ilmak knew an ancient wise proverb. To understand a person, you need to look at those who serve him, and perhaps the people of this man were partly fools and simpletons. That is why Ilmak doubted that they would follow a true villain or scoundrel. In the end, the leader sighed heavily, pondering everything he had heard. Now he realized the terrible truth. He was once again deeply indebted to his loyal comrades. Ilmak, looking at the man, began to mentally assemble all the pieces of the puzzle into their places. To be honest, his idea was not something grand or revolutionary from the very beginning. Simply put, he just wanted to open a school. Yes, indeed. The efforts of the demonic cult reduced the number of bandits in the region, but because of this, children had fewer reasons to feel the mercy and protection of the cult. As a result, their faith gradually weakened. Therefore, they began to doubt, not understanding. Why should they glorify the demonic cult at all? In the end, the school was supposed to be created precisely to fix this fundamental problem. Children would attend schools, naturally learning literacy and the sacred teachings of the cult there. Step by step, this would not only expand the cult's influence, but also create a reliable system for raising new devoted followers. When the hero came to the heavenly demon with this carefully thought-out plan, he read every line for a long time and attentively. However, he considered the document flawless, checked down to the smallest detail, and even thought the plan was so perfect thanks to the side effect of the soul-stealing sword technique, this obsession with perfection. However, the old man found one part of the plan that he still did not fully understand. According to what the hero wrote, did he want to teach something besides the sacred teachings? And indeed, in Ilmak's carefully thought-out plan, there was one more feature. He suggested teaching martial arts at school, presented as daily health exercises. The teacher was wary. Could it be that the hero wanted to teach all the children demonic arts? Of course, they could handle the side effects. However, if the students' hearts were not absolutely pure, it would only multiply unnecessary suffering and create new monsters. However, Ilmak did not want to teach the children specifically demonic techniques. He believed children should only be taught the basics of martial arts and external techniques. The teacher instantly understood. Surely the hero planned to select the most gifted and talented among them, and then teach them demonic arts separately. And the teacher completely correctly understood the young man's plan. After all, even if none of them mastered the demonic arts later, it was not so terrible. Even if they only learned the basics, the difference between those who know martial arts and those who have no training at all is truly huge. And children trained in martial arts from a young age will undoubtedly become a reliable support for the sect in the future. The deserters they recruited on the way here could help them with this. They know army martial arts, although slower, but absolutely without side effects. In any case, these people already wanted to join the sect. So with their invaluable help, Basic training will go smoothly. Moreover, they were perfectly suited for teaching children. They could be sent to those regions where a suitable person for the role of academy director had not yet been found. Honestly, listening to all this, Hyokrion-ilva sincerely praised the student for his painstaking efforts. By this time, he had already made a significant contribution to the development of the cult. So the heavenly demon generously allowed the young man to independently name the academy. He rightly assumed, surely the hero who came up with this brilliant plan already had a couple of worthy names. And honestly, the hero got the idea for the academy from the modern world, a place where they teach not only martial arts and physical training, but also cultivate character and strengthen the spirit. Something similar was now gaining crazy popularity abroad, including in the United States. Since Ilmak wanted the children to grow up big, strong, and sturdy, he decided to name it Taegan Dojang Academy. It would be a Taekwondo academy. After a tiring, long conversation with the heavenly demon, the guy finally managed to return home and immediately collapsed helplessly on the bed to rest a little. Although Chin-hen canceled the young gentleman's classes today, she was extremely surprised he didn't even want to wash before bed. However, Ilmak reminded, according to the master himself, he worked excellently today. So the young man wanted to forget absolutely all his duties and just collapse to sleep. The girl had no choice, so she let the hero rest blissfully. While he was rejoicing over the completed business trip, the young man thought, tomorrow he will finally be able to meet Sana. He was a little worried about whether she was offended that he disappeared without saying a word. Even if she got seriously offended, the hero had already bought her a wonderful gift. So surely the little girl would have forgiven him after that. After that, he took out an elegant little box that had been with him all this time, hidden in the folds of his clothing. However, the hero had not yet had time to properly examine her when he felt someone's presence in his room. When he cautiously looked up, he saw his third brother, So Winpian, had come to visit him. Of course, the frightened Ilmak immediately jumped up, deciding to carefully find out what had brought the young man here at such a late hour. The guy, acting as if nothing had happened, calmly explained. A whole pack of annoying guards constantly followed him in case he decided to beat someone up. So Winpian came here because he wanted to meet the hero without their intrusive knowledge. The third student was very surprised that the master was so proud of Ilmak. He invented a reporting system, created an academy, things So Winpian would never have thought of in his entire life. After that, the guy thought for a long time. What was the fundamental difference between him and the hero? And honestly, his words sounded like undisguised envy. So Ilmak was worried. This psycho would blow his head off if he said something wrong. However, suddenly he sharply snatched the box that Ilmak was turning over in his hands. The younger tried to take it back, not wanting his brother to look inside. However, he looked at the contents anyway, and finally understood. He and the younger brother really were very different people. Considering that he bought such a beautiful, elegant hairpin, surely something was already developing with that girl. In principle, the third brother was not even surprised. Anyone would like such a handsome guy as the hero. And the brother looked old, worn out, and worthless in comparison. For someone like him, there was only death and obscurity left. He wanted to kill everyone. Anger completely clouded his mind. So Ilmak immediately jumped up and desperately began to persuade his brother. The man he respected most after the master should not have spoken such cruel words about himself. Of course, the brother was very surprised that the hero adored him, second only to their master. However, Ilmak sincerely explained he was a worthless person. He didn't even consider himself worthy to enter the Hall of Demonic Arts. For someone like him, the third and eldest brother was a true role model, an unattainable ideal. So who was this hairpin intended for? Just a familiar girl. And even she says that people like the eldest brother are very popular among women. Of course, the embarrassed guy thought that the younger was just mocking him or shamelessly flattering, and the hero immediately began to argue heatedly, simultaneously taking the box back. He even lied that the teacher himself constantly praises his eldest student. Of course, you might not say that about Ilmak, but the master also often scolds him. Every time he says the same thing, Ilmak should take example from the third eldest brother in everything. Moreover, even his technique, 14 strikes in the abyss, was the best killing technique in the world. The master boasted a lot about how the brother managed to master this technique. However, at that moment, seeing his darkened face, the hero got the feeling that he had clearly said something unnecessary. Immediately after that, he lightning fast raised his sword and struck above the hero's head. Immediately after that, the fly that was flying over Ilmak's head was cut into 2 perfect parts and lifelessly fell to the ground. To Winfein, he coldly explained. What was demonstrated was the first of the 14 strikes in the abyss, after which he disappeared into the night, asking Ilmak to continue pondering the sword art of his elder brother and to strive to hone his skill. He also thanked his younger brother for the kind words that brightened this restless evening. He promised that he would visit the younger brother more often. And bowing, they said goodbye. The hero clearly understood. After he was drenched from wild stress, he would still have to change clothes, because he was soaked through. The next day at breakfast, the hero nervously explained to the maid. After breakfast, he would like to take a short walk. He was happy. Finally, he would see little Sena again. He had hardly slept because of the third elder brother, who had spent half the night with him. So he wanted to surround her with care and just rest his soul. However, unexpectedly, Jin Hina asked the master to come to her. Yesterday he couldn't properly train, so she wanted to make up for lost time today. Ilmak was very offended that the girl continued to treat him so harshly. Although he understood, there was no need for offense here. Chin Henna herself firmly explained. The progress of the young master was more important to her than anything else. She did not understand why he was always trying to run away somewhere. And Ilmak could not admit that he was going to meet his little sister. Although Chin Henna had long suspected, there was some other reason why he could not practice martial arts right now. In the end, the hero had to justify himself. There was no other reason. He was simply afraid that he would get sleepy after eating. Therefore, the maid immediately went to finish all the preparations for their lessons. Ilmak could only mentally apologize to little Sena, promising that he would definitely come to her. He hoped the girl would wait for him, no matter what it cost. In the end, the hero sat with his textbooks until late at night, memorizing the doctrine. When he began to lose focus from fatigue, Chin Henna immediately realized the young man seemed to be sleep-deprived. Ilmak simply could not admit to her that it was because of the third elder brother, because the maid might misunderstand him. In the end, stepping away from his workplace for a short time, he decided to go get some fresh air. And the maid decided to patiently wait for him at her place. Leaving the room, Ilmak could only hope the third elder brother would not come to visit him every night now, because lately he had not been getting enough sleep at all. He was curious. What exactly was So Winfian doing that he could walk around so calmly at night? In any case, if that guy started to annoy him, Ilmak would have to somehow resolve this delicate issue. But right now, all the young man wanted was to lie down with Sena on the grass, not to suffer over cursed doctrines. However, when he looked ahead, he saw Sena herself had come to his yard. And moreover, the hero was surprised when he noticed the tips of her hair had strangely, almost unnaturally, lightened. The hero snapped out of staring at the girl when she openly called him by name. Immediately, bending down, Ilmak looked apologetically into the little girl's face, not understanding. How did she know where he lived? Besides, he was worried. Was it okay for her to walk around alone so late? Surely her parents would be worried about her, and might even scold her. However, at that moment, the girl tightly grabbed the hero with her trembling hands, piercing him with her gaze. She wanted to know, why hadn't he come all this time? He had promised before that he would play with her every day. And then Chin Hanna heard how the hero began desperately apologizing to someone, explaining that he had some urgent reasons. In the end, she became extremely curious about what was happening. So she went to the window to look. At that very moment, Sena calmly explained to her brother that he was not to blame for anything. Moreover, she realized he was a disciple of that very heavenly demon. Therefore, having knocked the hero to the ground, she demanded that he go with her. In their clan, they would play games together, eat together, and even go to sleep together. At that moment, the boy understood. Something was wrong with Sena. So he tried to bring her to her senses. At that very moment, the little girl solemnly promised to take full responsibility for the hero so that he would not have to worry about anything. At that moment, the terrible truth, which Ilmak had been trying to escape all this time, suddenly surfaced in his memory. Sena had mastered demonic arts, and now had become a full member of the heavenly demon's family. At that moment, the faithful maid hurried to the young heir, whose astonishment was impossible to hide. She froze in bewilderment, discovering that the master, who had gone to enjoy the freshness of the evening air, was in such a strange position. The girl literally clung to him with a death grip. However, before Chinhaina could properly realize what was happening and offer help, little Sena suddenly dashed off like lightning. As soon as the child's gaze fell on the unfamiliar woman, a mad rage completely overtook her. The little girl attacked the maid, trying to tear apart the hated rival with her sharp claws. In her confused mind, the thought was clear. This very woman had become the barrier between her and Ilmak. It was because of her that the older brother forgot about his little companion and stopped playing with her. Now the girl was determined to get rid of this obstacle as soon as possible and finally return to the precious games with her older brother. However, observing the furious little girl, the experienced Chinhaina instantly recognized the child was possessed by a demonic spirit. Ilmaku had no choice but to beg the loyal maid not to cause irreparable harm to the girl. The young master made it clear that the baby was under the dark influence of a dark demon. She needed to be neutralized, but under no circumstances killed, because by nature she remained a good child. In the end, Chinhaina had practically no choice. The maid swiftly lunged at the baby, releasing her icy energy. Thanks to this, she managed to temporarily immobilize the girl, who froze like a pillar, greedily gasping for air with her slightly open mouth. Chinhaina immediately rushed to the young heir, wanting to help him, but Ilmoku himself was much more worried about the child's condition. The lady used a minor demonic technique to temporarily slow the girl's movements. Since the method did not affect her bloodstream, Sena would inevitably regain the ability to move soon. And indeed, no sooner had the shackles dissipated than the baby immediately lunged at Chinhaina with doubled fury. The young man had to push her away and shield the maid with his own body. As a result, he took the blow, and a bleeding wound immediately appeared on his shoulder. Sena, of course, stopped, but she had no idea what her beloved older brother was doing. She authoritatively ordered him to step away from Chinhaina and not interfere with the execution of just retribution. If he continued to stand in front of the hated rival, protecting her, the baby simply would not be able to eliminate the enemy without harming her beloved brother. However, when the hero did not move, a new thought suddenly pierced the child's mind. Sena guessed that perhaps the young man was connected to this girl by some romantic ties. This suspicion made her even angrier. The unbearable thought that the hero had not come to visit her, had not appeared all this time, precisely because he was spending precious moments with Chinhaina, burned her from within. However, instead of continuing to chatter and scold the little girl, Ilmak approached her and immediately gently hugged the trembling little body. The young man sincerely apologized for such a sudden absence without warning. Surely Sena was very worried about him. The young master hurried to explain that he disappeared because he received an urgent task from his teacher. He simply did not even have a fleeting chance to warn the girl in advance. In fact, he kept their meetings with Sena in the strictest secrecy from everyone. Of course, the hero was well aware. If he had revealed the truth to everyone earlier, the little girl would not have worried so desperately. But then their time together would have been under serious threat. Ilmok absolutely did not like the thought that they would no longer be able to see each other. However, it was extremely selfish to keep her in agonizing ignorance. The young man was clearly worried that the little one would hate him for this sudden disappearance. However, the girl burst into tears, confessing through her tears that she had never ever hated her older brother. She was just very worried about him. After that, the little girl began to apologize for his wounded shoulder, although the hero himself was not particularly bothered by that scratch. At that very moment, Lady Chin Haina herself became incredibly curious about when the young master had managed to get so close to the heir of the Hegrin clan. Ilmok had no idea how the maid was acquainted with this girl. The young man was, in principle, completely shocked when he realized that the little girl was the heir of Hegrin, and therefore the only granddaughter of the heavenly demon. Judging by the sincere reaction of the young gentleman, Chin Haina instantly realized that Ilmok really knew nothing about the clan's customs. The maid was just about to explain everything in detail when suddenly they felt the arrival of guests in the courtyard. It turned out to be the very lady and the mother of the little girl along with her servants. In the end, Chin Haina simply did not have time to explain everything to the hero right now. However, she firmly promised that she would definitely deal with it a little later. While they were gathering, the girl hurriedly explained that the arriving people were members of the powerful Hegrin family. The one who was walking at the front of the procession turned out to be Sina's lady mother, and indeed, her stern face resembled the expression that appeared on the little girl's face when she started to get angry. The girl herself was very frightened, fully understanding that her mother was surely extremely displeased with her escape. Ilmok promised the little one that he would talk to her mother. However, he asked her to wait a little in the house now and not get wet in the pouring rain. But Lady Chin Haina was incredibly curious about what the hero would come up with and how he would get out of such a delicate situation. However, the best solution in such a case was to try to find a common language with the arriving lady. The young man immediately apologized to the woman for having to come here in such harsh weather. Bowing respectfully, he greeted the lady, introducing himself as the 8th disciple of the heavenly demon. After that, as if nothing had happened, he decided to find out if everything was all right with the lady, and if she hadn't gotten too wet in the rain. However, before answering these formal questions, the woman had several much more important things she wished to inquire about. The lady was extremely interested to know what Ilmok's true intentions were regarding the young lady. Of course, the young gentleman had no idea what the visitor was hinting at. However, the woman already knew perfectly well that Sina had come here solely to find Ilmok. This meant only one thing. They were acquainted. However, the little girl would never have gone to someone first on her own initiative. So, surely the young gentleman had some secret intent, or he dared to break the custom. Ilmok was extremely upset that he was being accused of such intentions. The young man explained that he had accidentally met the girl, and they became friends. But obviously, the lady was angry, and could not believe these tales at all. And Ilmok did not intend to humiliate himself and beg her to believe him, proving his innocence. If the woman did not trust him, she could find out the truth herself. Moreover, he did not understand at all what custom was being talked about, and why everyone was so upset about it. Immediately after these words, the lady, shocked, covered her face with an elegant fan, trying to compose herself, and then she looked sternly reproachful at the hero's mentor, who was supposed to explain the local traditions and customs. In the end, the girl immediately hurried to apologize to the angry lady for having made such a serious mistake, not having had time to tell the student anything. And Ilmok quickly defended his mentor, for he was extremely focused on preparing for the entrance exam. All his knowledge and efforts were entirely devoted to the upcoming entrance exam. Therefore, the young man asked that the lady who had come here kindly tell him about those customs of which he was unaware. However, at that moment, the woman's gaze turned into the distance, behind the young man. When Ilmok turned around, he saw that Sena had stepped onto the porch, watching them closely, following every word of the conversation. The little girl was clearly trembling with unbearable fear. This made the mother realize that it was better not to raise such a delicate topic in the child's presence. The lady would prefer to discuss everything in private. In the end, they secluded themselves in a separate room. Chin Haina carefully poured them fragrant tea so that the conversation would flow more easily and naturally. And then Ilmak dared to ask the lady what this mysterious custom was, about which it was forbidden to speak in the presence of the girl. In the end, the mother explained that girls from the ancient Hekran family have been taught the art of the lonely claw from childhood, a bloody game with a monstrous side effect. This effect manifests in an extremely obsessed nature. The custom strictly forbade any contact until the child became attached to some object or being. Obviously, Ilmak thought that the woman was only worried that Sena could have harmed someone. However, if the problem was solely in this, the custom would not have been so strict and unyielding. The young master still did not understand that the world was not so simple and unambiguous. Obviously, becoming attached to people was completely natural for everyone. But people get injured, get sick, and eventually die. And no attachment can last forever. And for a member of the divine sect, these risks become even higher due to the numerous dangers of deadly duels. If the person to whom the girl studying this martial art became attached dies, then the little girl herself may follow him to the grave, or she may turn into an extremely insane creature and never regain her sanity. In the past, outsiders repeatedly tried to cunningly exploit this weakness. They directed the obsession of the women of the family towards someone specific or threatened that person with retribution. Thus, enemies tried to control the entire family, using women as tools and weapons. In the end, they observed this custom solely to protect Sena herself. Having explained everything in the smallest detail, the lady calmly nodded to the servants. After that, she stood up, intending to leave this place. The woman did not even intend to say goodbye, considering that there was simply no need for it. However, the hero himself decided to find out when the lady would stop throwing empty excuses and pathetic justifications at him. Of course, the lady herself became angry upon hearing such bold words. She was sure that perhaps Ilmak misspoke in the heat of emotions. The woman even magnanimously promised that she would forgive the audacious youth if he immediately apologized and took back his words. However, Ilmak could not forgive the lady for mocking Sena all this time and only being able to justify her cruel actions. They forced the little girl to practice dangerous demonic arts, using an ancient custom as a convenient excuse. But at the same time, they did not give the girl maternal love and warmth for the same reason. The young man was angry because they did not give the child a choice. They did not even know what she herself wanted. As a parent, the lady is obliged to understand what she is making her own daughter sacrifice. And of course, the woman herself was extremely enraged that some newcomer who had just arrived in this sect pretended to understand the true essence of what was happening. She could not hold back and cried. The lady accused Ilmak of not even realizing in his inexperienced head how much pain he personally caused this child. And Ilmak did not even try to lie. He really did not know how much suffering he caused the little girl. But the young man knew one thing. The true reason lay in the lies of her own mother and the insufficient faith in her daughter. In the end, the lady completely lost her temper, amazed that Ilmak dared to speak to her so boldly. The enraged woman immediately attacked the insolent man to teach the scoundrel a lesson, who knew nothing and only babbled with his tongue. She had already aimed her deadly fan at him, when suddenly, defending the student, an old mentor stood before him, ready to take the blow himself. Of course, the lady herself was also frightened, as if struck by lightning. Fortunately, she managed to stop the attack at the last moment. Immediately after that, the woman fell to her knees to respectfully greet the demon lord. Hekran Ilva himself, as if nothing had happened, explained to the youngest of the students that he hurried here so as not to be late for training. And he witnessed a truly unusual sight, one he had never seen before. He had many questions. However, first the elder decided to find out just one thing. He was incredibly curious to know what the young man meant when he spoke of a lack of faith in this divine sect. However, Ilmak, as if nothing had happened, reminded that according to the demon lord himself, all side effects of demonic arts could be overcome. This is what the master said when the young lord had just begun studying dangerous demonic practices. However, Ilmak was extremely dissatisfied with what he saw now. Everyone behaved as if Sina was doomed to succumb to the destructive side effects. It literally looked in his eyes as if the lady herself did not believe in her own clan or in her daughter. So, approaching closer, he explained to the woman that the faith he was talking about was for her, as a mother, to believe more in Sena. The little girl is still a child, but she is far from stupid. Not weak, she will cope with the side effects of the art of the lone claw, the bloody game. Even if a little help is needed, the girl will be able to pull herself together. And obviously, Ilmak believed that the lady herself as a mother should know this better than anyone else. However, it remained a mystery to the woman herself why the young man believed so strongly in the young lady. However, Ilmak only reminded that the girl was a child of a great and proud clan. Finally, when the conversation ended, the lady left the room. She quickly noticed her little daughter and realized that the little girl had been eavesdropping on their conversation all this time. The mother did not even get angry. Instead, she turned around and suggested returning to their estate. Meanwhile, the little one nervously shifted from foot to foot, not knowing how to speak to her mother. Obviously, the woman assumed that the girl was so insecure because she wanted to visit this place again. And basically, she was absolutely right. But the little girl needed some more time to gather her strength and admit it. In the end, clenching her fists tighter, she told her mother that she would like to come here much more often. The girl solemnly promised that she would become a worthy lady of the Hekran clan. She also swore that in return she would obey in everything she was told and would train even harder. And in the end, although at first glance the mother seemed displeased, she still turned to the little girl. The woman saw that her daughter's promises were not just empty words. The girl was truly ready to fulfill all of it, for her eyes literally shone with determination. At the very moment when the hero was changing clothes, the maid continued tidying up the room, which was in complete disarray after the lady's visit. The old man remarked with a smirk that his granddaughter was already head over heels in love with Ilmak. He noticed the young man's wound. Today the young master was lucky to get off with a light injury, but one day the side effects could cost him his life. The mentor was not sure that his student would manage to handle this child. However, Ilmak firmly knew Sena would never treat him badly. Moreover, even if it happened, he was ready to endure everything. In the end, the old man smiled, allowing the hero to act as he deemed necessary. Although inside the master was amazed, the young man turned out to be even more remarkable than expected. The young master devised a very deep scheme, one that even the ruler of the demonic cult had not thought of. If everything went smoothly, the Hekran clan could become a loyal ally for them, and that meant that the day would surely come when Ilmak would no longer be called simply the disciple of the heavenly demon. Several more days passed since that very conversation, and so, as agreed, during the next training session, the hero's mentor decided to take a break to rest a little and compose himself. Fortunately, since that memorable day, the hero no longer had any problems with the Hekran clan. After all, no one dared to interfere with the matter personally handled by the heavenly demon himself. However, suddenly, a young lady ran onto the training ground, who immediately rushed into the arms of her older brother with a joyful cry. The little girl immediately decided to ask how his training was going. Ilmak, looking at the happy child, recalled that conflict with the lady and the angry look of the master, who seemed like he would not hold back and would kill him on the spot. But everything ended well. And looking at the happy girl, Ilmak was glad that he had stood up for her and gone against the others. Although much was permitted in the demonic cult, mocking children was already a clear excess that he did not want to allow. Moreover, the young man really could use a good rest. If he could not even allow himself such moments of peace, he would definitely go insane. At that moment, the girl, having finished her enthusiastic story about the training, decided to ask her brother what he had been doing. Only then did the young man remember that he wanted to give the little girl something he had completely forgotten. He reminded her that he had recently gone on an errand for the master. The young man saw an elegant hairpin and immediately thought it would suit the girl, so he bought it. Honestly, The little girl's eyes shone with unearthly beauty at this small item. However, she, like a madwoman, began rubbing her little face against the box. After all, it was a gift from her beloved little brother. Of course, Ilmak noticed that Sina's expression changed sharply, so he immediately distracted her with conversation. In the end, the girl, having calmed down a little, promised that she would wear this hairpin on some important day, for she was very afraid of breaking it. And Ilmak realized with relief that the little girl was still managing to control the side effects quite steadily. However, unexpectedly, all three felt that someone had come to visit them. It turned out to be the eldest and third brother who came to visit the youngest. Of course, the hero immediately bowed respectfully, not understanding what these two had forgotten here. After all, so Vinpen visited them every evening. However, the elder never came to see him. The third brother explained that he came to Ilmak because he was accompanying the elder brother. He was extremely concerned about the personnel issue in the Red Dragon Corps and wanted Ilmak to help him. Sam himself, Vijin Hak, with a smile reported that rumors about the genius of their younger sage are spreading everywhere. Therefore, he hoped that the younger would share his wisdom with his somewhat foolish older brother. And honestly, Ilmak panicked. After all, if he had refused his older brother, he would have simply exploded with rage. In the end, the young man had no choice but to dry off for half an hour and try to figure out the problem. However, having listened to everything, unfortunately, Ilmak did not come to any definite answer. Bowing, he apologized for being useless in this matter, and the elder brother was not angry, understanding that a person's choice is always a difficult matter, especially when it concerns the deputy commander of the Red Dragon Corps. If it were easier, he would not have turned to Ilmak with this request. The hero managed to exhale with great relief that the elder did not explode, and he did not get more work. But at that moment, the first brother saw the girl who was standing next to the young man. He quickly realized that she was a young lady from the Hecken clan. The elder heard that she visited their younger brother the sage from time to time. At that moment, noticing the box in her hands, he thought that perhaps the lid of the casket would not open, and decided to help her. He put a little more effort into the box because the lid was tight. Ilmak tried to explain anxiously to his brother that he needed to loosen his grip. Then the box would open by itself. Even the girl fearfully asked to give the box back because he could break it. And in the end, indeed, the box shattered into the tiniest pieces right in his hands. Together with this box, watching its shards flying everywhere, it seems that something also broke inside the little baby, causing her to forget how to breathe. After that, the girl completely lost her temper, not understanding how the boy dared to break the gift that her beloved brother had given her. The child had already threatened to tear the culprit to pieces immediately, but Ilmak successfully covered the little girl's mouth with his palm. The older brother immediately began to apologize for his mistake. Fortunately, what was inside the little box still survived, so Ilmak immediately handed the hairpin to the girl, asking her not to cry and not to worry. The little girl took the hairpin with trembling hands and began to calm down little by little. The gift from her brother was unharmed. Right after that, Ilmak hugged the little one so that she would no longer worry, while the older brothers marveled at their deep bond. Chinhana promised these two that they would calm the lady down, so she asked the brothers to leave them for a short while. Before leaving, the older brother only apologized to the younger one for causing so many problems due to his clumsiness. Ilmak calmly and with a smile said goodbye to them, but inwardly hoped they would not decide to come back again. Moreover, he was surprised that the first brother was not as hot-tempered as the hero had thought. Perhaps he could behave a little more freely with him. However, unexpectedly, the still crying girl confessed to the younger brother that the great young lord was a complete idiot, and the older brother heard these words, which made him twitch. Chinhina immediately scolded the girl, asking her not to speak like that anymore. Ilmak was worried that Vijin Hak might hear such words, and indeed, approaching closer, the first brother ordered the younger to repeat the words of this little girl. Despite smiling, it was clearly visible. The guy was trying with all his might to hide his boiling anger. At that moment, Chinhina asked the elder young master not to react so sharply to what had happened. Ilmak, however, demanded that the girl immediately apologize to the elder brother. The third demanded that Ilmak shut this child's mouth before the situation worsened. However, unfortunately, the hero did not manage to do anything. The girl immediately reminded again that the great young master was an idiot, since he couldn't even open the box. In the end, after this, she buried her face in Ilmak's chest, and everyone turned around fearfully, waiting for the reaction of the first brother. In the end, one look at his mad face was enough for them to understand. No one here would get off easy. However, Ilmak still could not understand this strangeness. Vijin Hak had called himself an idiot a minute ago, but he got terribly angry when someone else called him that word. In the end, Ilmak immediately handed the girl over to the maid, asking her to take her to a safe place. After that, he explained to the first brother that he had a solution to his problem. He instantly calmed down, coming to his senses. However, he did not understand what solution was being referred to, and Ilmak reminded them of their conversation regarding the Red Dragon Squad. The first brother needed to appoint the third squad commander as deputy. It was the best move. After all, even though the third commander was the weakest of all, it was not that important. Since the commander was Vijin Hak himself, combat power was not critically important. The third squad commander handled paperwork better than anyone else. This meant that he would be perfect and become a reliable support for the First Lord. Saying all this, Ilmoku could only hope that the topic translation would help the first brother come to his senses and forget about the burning anger. However, Vijin Hak was only offended. He thought that Ilmak was hinting that he was an idiot, and that means he should have appointed a smart third commander as deputy. Immediately after this, the enraged elder brother lunged at the younger brother, immediately wielding a deadly sword. Unfortunately, it was already too late to dodge, so Ilmak decided to try to block this attack. However, his hands were trembling. It felt as if his body refused to move. Fortunately, at the last moment, he managed to block the attack. However, his sword shattered into small fragments in an instant. The whole matter was that the older brother turned out to be too strong. Even after the young man used the flying sword, soul-capturing technique, scarlet blood gushed from the boy's mouth. The very fact that he managed to block the strike from such a monster was a huge miracle. All he could do was hope that So Winpen would finally come up with something and deal with this psychotic monster. At that moment, the third brother really lunged at the elder, using his signature sword strikes. However, in the end, Vijin Hak changed the trajectory of his flight and immediately struck him hard in the face. But despite this, So Winpen managed to break free from his iron grip and immediately began showering the first with furious attacks, begging him to come to his senses, but unfortunately, it did not help. Despite the wounds gaping on the elder student's body, he still remained in a state of rage. In the end, a fierce clash began between the two, which seemed as if even the entire training ground would instantly turn to dust. Ilmak at that moment tried to recover a little after the injury, as his body was too weakened. Suddenly, someone placed a hand on his shoulder, and everything in his body froze. He was very afraid that it was Vijin Hak. Fortunately, it was Lady Chin Haina who came to help the young man. In the blink of an eye, she took care of the little girl by pressing her vital points. The maid left the child unconscious near the tree. After that, she reported to the younger master that she also needed to join the fight. She asked Ilmak to use this chance to escape before Vijin Hak finished him off. However, the hero found her priorities quite strange. There were too few of them. Help needed to be called, not to engage in a hopeless fight. The difference in strength was too great. Of course, if the young man had run away, he might even have survived. But if he acts like that, then probably. So Vinpen will pay for it with his own life. The only way to save everyone was one. He urgently needed to intervene in this bloodthirsty duel. In this moment, the first brother had already thrown off the third. When he crashed into the ground, scarlet blood flowed from his mouth. To the first air rushed Madame Chin Haina in an attempt to stop him briefly. However, feeling her approach, the guy immediately grabbed her and pressed her to the ground himself. He wanted to kill her, and then everyone who was nearby. However, when he was about to stab the maid with his sword, he heard the voice of Ilmak calling him an idiot. After that, the younger one began to provoke him in every possible way to make him get distracted from the murder. He even joked about the first brother, saying that apparently his head is only for wearing a hat, if he reacts so stiffly to his words. Obviously, the enraged Vijin Hawk immediately lunged at that bastard to kill him, and that exactly marked the beginning of their deadly chase. Chinhaina immediately understood what was going on and ordered the young master to run away. And he really ran. And Vijin Hawk rushed after him like a madman. At that time, the girl tried to get up to go to help, but unfortunately, she was badly wounded. So Winpen approached, patted her on the shoulder, and asked her to rest a little. Then he rushed to run after the two to protect the younger one. Obviously, if they just keep waiting for help, everyone will die. Therefore, Ilmak was now rushing to the place where help could be called to survive. At that moment, the boy suddenly stumbled. Taking advantage of this, the older brother caught up with him and launched an attack with internal energy. As a result, the tree where the attack hit was destroyed by an explosion as if struck by a thunderbolt. And the older brother, without hesitation, immediately jumped up, aiming his sword at the younger sibling. Fortunately, at that moment, the third brother arrived and protected the hero by blocking with his sword. After that, he looked towards Ilmak to understand what his plan was. However, before the boy could explain anything, so Winpen ordered him to run away immediately. In the end, fortunately, two fighters who were nearby came to them, which somewhat eased the burden of the third brother. But this was still not enough to calm the first disciple without the master's help. In that moment, one of the warriors fell to the ground, and Vijin Hawk had already pounced on him. However, fortunately, he managed to dodge. Ilmak again began to call him an idiot in every possible way, who even loses his temper on the wrong people. He mocked the fact that Vijin Hawk decided to boast about his stupidity in front of others. Fortunately, with these words, he managed to attract the attention of the first brother. Now, while the others restrained him, the younger one had to not run away anywhere. However, at that moment, the boy threw his sword, causing it to fly towards the third brother. However, bypassing him, he headed straight for the hero's face, and such things clearly were not part of the young man's plans. Fortunately, when the explosion cleared, they heard the well-known voice of the master asking everyone to step back. He praised the students who worked hard, holding back the older brother. But further, the master himself will be able to handle it. However, as if not noticing the master in front of him, Vijin Hawk still rushed at the younger brat to finish him off. The mentor calmly looked at him and applied the binding paths technique on the boy. As a result, an unimaginable energy began to choke his entire body, pressing him to the ground. He still tried to resist, and the old man only said that he had to repeat twice for the student to calm down. Very soon he growled angrily, like a true madman. However, under the influence of the great heavenly demon's spell, he still bowed and greeted the Lord. Immediately after that, the now calm hero finally sat down on the ground to catch his breath after the stress endured. And so Winpen, leading the others, approached the first brother to tie him up with ropes and neutralize him. At that moment, Ilmak, seeing his master in action, finally understood that he truly deserved to be the heavenly demon. Thus, the master quickly managed to suppress the anger of the first brother. Fortunately, there were no casualties, so the punishment was limited to confinement in the meditation hall. And since Sena was the cause of the riot, the Hegrin clan did not oppose such a mild punishment. However, there was still one hitch. Although Ilmak was wounded, and at the same time Lady Chinhaina was also injured, their lessons continued anyway. Approaching the young master, she ordered him to open the book in order to continue studying the doctrines from the point where they had left off. Of course, the young man immediately pointed to his broken hand, not understanding how she intended to teach him when he was in such a condition. Then the girl thought that the hero might prefer to practice external martial arts. But obviously, that was even worse than studying the doctrine. Chinhaina herself understood this perfectly. Therefore, she explained that if he trained with such wounds, serious complications could arise. She asked him to study theory for now, and then they could catch up on what was missed. At that moment, to check on his student, The master also came, finding him in bed. The maid immediately knelt to greet the lord, and the hero got out of bed to bow himself. However, he asked the two not to trouble themselves and to remain where they were. Ilmak at that moment explained that he was perfectly fine thanks to the help of a skilled healer, and it was clear that this greatly pleased the old man. So he immediately smiled. The mentor also explained that he had come to the student not only to check on him, but also to reward him. Thanks to his ingenuity, the damage was minimal, and his past merits were already great. Of course, Ilmak was incredibly curious about what kind of reward the heavenly demon himself had prepared for him, and he decided to grant the boy the elixir of their order. And at the same time, he would give him even more time for training, which in translation meant that the boy would have to work even harder. Chinhaina burst into tears of happiness, for the Lord's mercy was truly boundless. The hero expected such a reaction from a fan. However, that was not all for which the master had come here. It turned out the first brother wanted to meet the hero after all that he had done. Therefore, if Ilmak himself was not against it, the teacher wanted to make an exception for the young man and allow them to meet after all. Honestly, Ilmak was not very eager to see his older brother again, but whether he wanted it or not, sooner or later they would have to meet anyway. So the only thing, before the journey, he decided to check if the doors in the detention hall were sturdy enough. In the end, when he agreed, they immediately went to meet the first brother, and the master accompanied the hero. Finally, around the next corner was the detention place where the unruly boy was locked up. The master decided to step aside to allow Ilmak and the senior student to talk calmly, and the boy, unfortunately, could not even admit that he felt awkward being alone with his brother. He was very worried that the first one might still be angry because of the words he had provoked him with. He didn't even know if he should immediately bow and fall to his knees before him, begging forgiveness for those words. Therefore, since most of the hero's wounds had already healed, he decided that if he noticed anything wrong, he would definitely run to call the master to prevent what happened last time. However, when the young man knocked on the detention hall, Vijin Hak only laughed cheerfully, sincerely glad that his younger brother had come to visit him. The senior disciple admitted that he had called Ilmak here solely to offer his apologies. Now he fully understood why the younger brother had provoked him so boldly. Thanks to the hero's persistent efforts, the man's punishment was minimal. This was the best decision under the circumstances. Vijin Hak was glad that at least the younger brother was lucky. He was not such a reckless fool as his narrow-minded senior fellow disciples. Moreover, the first disciple apologized for inadvertently involving Ilmak in trouble because of his own uncontrollable temper. The hero calmly sat down on the other side of the door and reminded him of their recent conversation. Then Ilmak recommended that the elder brother appoint the third squad commander as his deputy. The young man wanted to clarify that this recommendation wasn't given to in any way humiliate the dignity of the first disciple. There is an ancient saying, "The larger the army, the better the commander." Once the famous General Han declared that he was capable of commanding an army of 100,000 warriors. The emperor then curiously inquired, "Why does such a talented military commander serve under his command?" To which the general wisely replied that His Majesty is not a warrior in the direct sense. He is the one who commands generals like himself. Countless such examples have been encountered in history. Even when brilliant strategists were born, their true rulers still remained the emperors. History clearly demonstrates that the most important quality for a true leader is by no means strategy, but the unparalleled ability to earn the unconditional trust of the people. Along with this, it is also necessary to skillfully place subordinates in those positions where they will bring the greatest benefit to the common cause. That is why Ilmak recommended the first brother appoint the third as squad commander. With his outstanding administrative abilities, all minor problems will resolve themselves. Then the first disciple will be able to fully concentrate on the true duties of a real leader, for he is destined one day to lead the entire demonic cult. Therefore, the younger brother asked that the elder not take this proposal as an offense or insult. On the contrary, it is better for him to fully dedicate himself to training, for such focus will bring him even more success in the future. When the master heard all the words spoken by the hero, he immediately approvingly praised the boy, gently tousling his head, after which he decided to interrupt their conversation and escort the youth back to his estate. Ilmok could only hope that with his words, he had not again hurt the pride of the elder brother, for all this was said exclusively to somehow smooth over the offense that had arisen between them. And when the master praised the hero, he thought that perhaps the teacher liked how skillfully Ilmok had wriggled out of the delicate situation. In fact, when the younger brother left his confinement, a flame of such incredible power began to rage inside the senior disciple that it seemed ready to burst out at any moment and incinerate everything around. Dark thoughts commanded him to kill the younger brother, for it was this audacious youth who dared to call him an idiot. Vaijinhak longed to destroy everyone who looked down on him, who mocked him. He cursed this unjust world that had given him so many humiliations. However, recalling the wise advice of the younger brother, he tried to pull himself together. This became a turning point when the man suppressed the destructive anger that was devouring him from within. In the end, the senior disciple overcame the threshold of awareness of the demon's path and practically reached the desired stage of acceptance. He poured out all his raging fury in a wild outburst of anger. And now Ilmok also reminded him that there are matters far more important than petty grievances. As a result, the gears fell into place. By doing so, he was able to clear his mind and make it as clear as the flawless surface of a mirror. He directed all this crystal clarity straight onto the path of accepting the demonic path. Vaijinhak pondered for a long time in confinement over the idea of gathering talents and properly placing them in the right positions. He sincerely hoped that the younger brother would grow up as soon as possible, for the first disciple passionately wished to make this very person his chief strategist. At that very time, unknown individuals were whispering about the younger disciple of the heavenly demon, who proposed this strange system. Many considered him an eccentric guy, especially after that audacious proposal to found some unprecedented academy. However, according to rumors, he incredibly strongly influenced the elder brother's breakthrough to embracing the demonic path. If this youth continues to hover around the first disciple, he might become a big problem for their secret future plans. Therefore, now they needed to decide what to do. They could not just sit idly by. However, suddenly, their elder suggested dealing with this audacious boy, the same way as with those already resting in graves. That should be more than enough to finally destabilize the divine cult of the celestial demon once again. Soon the hero was approached again by his guards, who had accompanied him during the journey. By order of the Lord of 10,000 Demons and head of the Guardians Institute, they were appointed his escorts again. After such an uproar, it was impossible to leave the youth defenseless. Swearing faith and truth to serve the young master and protect him from all harm, the warriors bowed respectfully. Of course, the hero accepted them into his service. However, he felt somewhat awkward that so many overseers were around. Nevertheless, the youth was grateful that familiar people had been sent to him. The guards promised to keep a respectful distance while on duty, so as not to cause inconvenience to the young master. After that, they said goodbye and assured they would appear instantly if the young heir faced the slightest danger. Ilmok already knew these two guards well. However, there was still one stranger left in his chambers, an unknown face the hero saw for the first time. The guy immediately hurried to introduce himself. His name was Gyan Moon from the Ghost Sect. He explained to the young master with a friendly smile that he was sent to serve him loyally and very much hoped that they would work wonderfully together. Obviously, Ilmok had heard about the Guyan clan. After all, it was one of the 5 great demonic houses. Moreover, the young man came from the legendary Ghost Sect, so the hero was extremely curious about what this young man was doing here. It turned out that the guy studied at the academy in the same class as Chin Hana, and since his classmate was injured and could not properly perform her duties, he reported this to the sect leader. The leader graciously allowed him to come to his comrade's aid. Of course, the hero perfectly understood that the lady did not need any help at all, but he thanked Gaian Moon politely with a smile for his concern. Ilmok was not ready for his plans to be ruined. The guy secretly wanted to use Chin Haina's injuries as a convenient opportunity to rest from harsh training. Moreover, the young man had the sect leader's approval. All that remained for the hero was simply to accept it and allow the guy to provide assistance. However, Chin Haina herself categorically protested. She did not need any help from Gaian Moon, so he could calmly return home. Even in her current state, the lady was able to serve the young master without any problems, which she did not fail to remind the persistent guest. Gaian Moon did not understand her stubbornness at all. The girl was barely standing on her feet, yet she spoke with such unwavering confidence. However, the lady was still fiercely angry, ordering the guy not to meddle in other people's affairs. And, honestly, Ilmok saw this side of her character for the first time. She openly and boldly contradicted someone for the first time, and Gaian Moon, stepping closer, simply asked his acquaintance to stop being stubborn. Considering that the girl was significantly weaker than him, the young man felt as if she had completely stopped training properly. Since the very time they studied together at the academy, Chin Haina had not changed in strength at all, so there was a depressing feeling as if she had wasted her once brilliant talent and ruined her own body, without even reaching that great goal she had so passionately dreamed of in her youth. In the end, the young man calmly explained to the girl that he could easily help the young master instead of her, and it would be better for her to go rest and properly recover her strength. However, the lady was frankly offended that Gaian Moon dared to look down on her. The young man only skillfully explained that he did not want to appear too confident. However, he sincerely thought that in such a pitiful state, Chin Haina would only become a burden to the young master. If she continued to serve in such a condition, others would start whispering behind their backs. Everyone would point fingers and wonder, what is wrong with this master if his servant looks so miserable? However, Ilmok hastily shut the young man's mouth because he had a clear feeling that Gaian Moon was reproaching the lady for not developing and not progressing precisely because she served the hero. Of course, the young man immediately began to apologize. He did not mean that at all. The young man was simply sorry to see a talented girl in the role of an ordinary servant. But whatever Gaian Moon's true intentions were, Ilmok categorically did not want to hear such offensive words anymore. After that, the hero also asked Chin Haina not to worry about anything, because he did not consider her a burden for a moment. However, when the young man looked at her face, he clearly saw that the girl was completely crushed. Even her face noticeably paled and became gaunt from the heavy thoughts that overwhelmed her. So Ilmok could only sigh heavily, not understanding who in the world had the idea to send someone like Gaian Moon here. Now the hero urgently needed to come up with any way to diffuse this unbearably icy atmosphere that hung in the chambers. At the same moment, Gaian Moon, boldly ignoring the young master's order, went to deliver a message and prepare to fulfill his duties. Of course, Ilmok decisively ordered the guy to stop immediately. After all, if he continued to spout such nonsense, it would be better for him to simply keep quiet. However, unexpectedly, the hero saw the young man handing the girl some unusual herb, something rare and invigorating. Gaian Moon explained that he found this ginseng while walking here along the road. He was a very busy man, so it was already time for him to return to his affairs in the ghost sect. The guy asked Chin Haina to accept this small gift and get well soon. Honestly, it looked like a blatant pickup line. So Ilmok could only guess what had actually happened between these two in the past. Soon, young Lady Sena hurried towards Ilmok, already drenched in bitter tears. The little girl apologized for a long time for the fact that because of her careless words, both her older brother and all the other innocent people had suffered. So the hero had to patiently explain that she did not need to take what happened to her older brother so much to heart. After all, he was sometimes like a real natural disaster that swept everything in its path. At that moment, the little girl calmed down and wiped away her tears. However, she immediately became alert upon seeing an unfamiliar face. The child was extremely curious about who this young man was, who seemed to follow the hero like a shadow. The young man bowed politely before the young lady, explaining that he temporarily served the young master in place of Chin-Haina. Obviously, Sena immediately wished that this young man would now forever serve Ilmoku instead of that bitchy madam. The little girl thought he was much more reliable and better than that incomprehensible nasty girl. And honestly, the hero felt extremely awkward hearing such words, for he did not recall Chin-Haina ever treating Sena badly even once. In fact, if Ilmak were more honest, he would secretly want this young man to remain his servant, because ever since Chin-Haina stepped away from the matter, the training has become much easier and more enjoyable. And besides, finally, a newcomer appeared in his palace, someone who could be thoroughly teased and jovially joked about. The problem was only that this seemingly good-natured guy boldly showed his audacity exclusively towards Chin-Haina. Of course, after yesterday's stormy demonstration of emotions, it was not difficult to understand the true reason. Surely it reminded of those elementary school times when a boy who secretly likes a girl pulls her pigtails. The hero sincerely hoped that he would somehow miraculously manage to reconcile these two. Then the problem would resolve itself. At first, Ilmak wanted to make them work together. They are both young and full of boundless energy, so the young man could easily create an opportunity for them in which they would finally work together as a single team. However, when the hero came to the lady with this proposal, she categorically refused to work with Gaian Moon. Honestly, the girl was so adamant in her decision that Ilmak didn't even know what to answer. In the end, the young man decided to lighten the tense atmosphere a bit and cautiously find out what the lady had been doing here all this time, sitting alone in her chambers. It turned out that she did not appear at training sessions because she was painstakingly rewriting the sacred texts by hand all that precious time. Although Ilmak found this quite strange. After all, the lady had surely learned them long ago, knowing every line by heart. However, Chin-Haina calmly explained that since she had become a burden to the young master, she was preparing texts for him to study independently, to at least provide some help in this way. In the end, Ilmak decided to somehow belittle Gaian Moon's merits in the lady's eyes, so he told with disapproval that this guy did not know basic etiquette at all. The hero was calmly sitting on the training ground when that guy arrogantly began sweeping the dusty floor right in front of him. Because of this, all the raised dust flew straight into the face, not only of Ilmak himself, but also of the young lady Sena. The girl could hardly imagine what kind of discomfort they were all experiencing at that moment. The lady quietly smiled at that moment, having listened to all these words. Ilmak, of course, noticed this, so he decided to find out what the girl was like during her academy days. The hero thought that she was not like she is now, and perhaps even back in those distant times, she disliked Gaian Moon's annoying assistant, and it turned out to be so. From the very first meeting, the girl hated him with all her heart. Chin-Haina was the eldest daughter in an ordinary family from the divine cult. Her parents were unremarkable, neither in abilities nor appearance, like all other ordinary people. The birth of Chin-Haina was a true miracle for them. The girl inherited rare beauty and outstanding talent in martial arts from distant ancestors. Everyone in the village simply adored her. Since childhood, Chin-Haina dreamed of devotedly serving the divine cult, helping ordinary people, and becoming a truly worthy person. For this noble goal, she prepared from a young age to enter the Hall of Demonic Arts. In her native village, she was considered an incomparable genius, so neither her parents, nor the villagers, nor Chin-Haina herself doubted her brilliant success for a moment. And she justified their hopes. She brilliantly passed the entrance exams. It seemed the girl's life would be smooth and cloudless. But harsh reality proved to be much more merciless. At the very first exam in the Hall of Demonic Martial Arts, she took only 19th place out of 20. Only then did Chin-Haina bitterly realize that she was merely a frog at the bottom of a well. She felt unbearably ashamed for having so arrogantly overestimated her modest talent. However, despite this crushing disappointment, the girl was not going to give up and stubbornly moved only forward. She perfectly understood that she started a little below the level of the other students and sincerely believed if she worked hard, she would definitely catch up with everyone. This unwavering faith made her think only about endless training and learning. Or rather, Chin Hana desperately tried to concentrate. However, one young man appeared, constantly distracting her from her studies. Seeing that she was studying difficult texts, he politely explained that the section they were currently going through was indeed incredibly hard to understand. So the guy generously could help her and explain everything in detail. However, the girl was only angry at this young man, who was born into a noble family, because everything came too easily to him. Therefore, she decisively refused his help and immediately left to figure everything out on her own. Gyan Moon was a little hurt by her cold refusal. After all, she didn't even listen to his sincere offer. Because of her, the lessons ended later than usual once again, while the teacher patiently explained everything only to her. Therefore, the young man politely asked that the girl not hesitate to ask for help if needed. After all, he was trying not to help her personally, but for the common good of all the students. To great regret, Gyan Moon's interference in her student life did not end there. Throughout all the years of training in the hall, he constantly meddled with his unsolicited advice. In both martial arts and studies, the guy literally surpassed her in everything, so he behaved somewhat arrogantly. Of course, every time after his persistent help, the girl's self-esteem was shattered to dust. Chin Hina hated herself for being the one who was helped, rather than helping someone else. She hated Gyan Moon even more for meddling with his unnecessary help. To overcome this vile, humiliating feeling, to finally knock Gyan Moon off the pedestal, she trained like a maniac. But until the very graduation from the martial arts hall, she never managed to surpass him even once. The girl honestly admitted to the hero that she hated the guy because he always looked down on her. Probably that is why the divine cult directed her to study the art of demonic fists, so that she would get rid of these destructive evil thoughts. It was truly a trial for her to become better, and it seems it helped her find inner peace. The hero could only sigh heavily, as he had no idea how Gyan Moon could be such a hopeless idiot in matters of human relationships. The next day, Ilmak approached him to have a serious one-on-one talk. The young man admitted that yesterday, he finally learned from the lady why she disliked the guy so much. Of course, Gyan Moon was very frightened upon learning this revelation. He sincerely thought that he had always treated the girl well, clearly not noticing his glaring flaws. Ilmak hurried to patiently explain to the guy that there were many problems, and the main one was Gyan Moon's own attitude. The guy should immediately stop meddling with his unnecessary help towards the girl. He simply must silently observe and recognize her as an equal combat comrade. Moreover, if the young man really had romantic feelings for her, it would be better to honestly confess this directly. Ilmak very much hoped that the young man correctly understood his wise words. This should have been enough for him to finally correct his foolish behavior. It is unlikely that they will start dating immediately now, but at least the relationship between them will stop rapidly deteriorating. Obviously, the guy was incredibly grateful to the young master for guiding him onto the path of truth. Gyan Moon really, no matter how much he recalled, never once confessed his true feelings to Chin Hain. Hence, all this unfortunate misunderstanding between them arose. Immediately after this frank conversation, he rushed swiftly to the girl's room to immediately fix everything. At that very time, the lady finally fully healed her injured leg, so she was able to remove the annoying bandage from it. At that moment, even without knocking, the young master Gyan Moon burst into her chambers. He nervously admitted that young master Ilmak had explained everything to him in detail. The girl confessed that she hated him because the guy constantly tried to help her obsessively. Gyan Moon hastily explained that it was an unfortunate misunderstanding. After all, he helped her not because he considered her pathetic and worthless. At that moment, the worried hero ran in after, who very much hoped that the guy would not blurt out some nonsense. And so in the end, Gyan Moon still said what had been boiling inside, confessing directly to the girl. All this time, she had madly liked him. He loved her. The young man fell in love with her at first sight, as soon as he first saw her at the academy. Then he simply passionately wanted to please her, thinking, if he helped, she would definitely pay attention to him. The guy sincerely apologized for misunderstanding her feelings, as he meant no harm. At that moment, Guyan Moon noticed with anxiety how the girl was seized by a cold shiver. Demonic energy around her began to rage frighteningly, and as soon as the young man instinctively tried to help her, Chin Hyena immediately pushed him away fiercely. Initially, she firmly believed that the young man saw her as a rival and competitor. However, the matter turned out to be completely different. She had so desperately tried to surpass Guyan Moon all this endless time. But it turned out he did not care about her abilities at all. This meant only one thing. All these years, Chin Hyena herself had been indulging in her imagined inferiority. Therefore, now the girl was extremely curious to find out why Guyan Moon always made her feel so insignificant and pathetic. Of course, the young man was still desperately trying to justify that he never intended to offend her. However, the girl, having completely lost control, immediately began to mercilessly attack the guy. Ilmok, who was carefully observing this confrontation, strongly asked Mr. Guyan Moon not to rush into battle. Instead, it was better to retreat and let the girl vent her anger. However, the guy did not particularly care about these furious attacks. After all, he was significantly stronger than the young lady. Honestly, with these confident words, he only angered the furious girl even more. In the end, Guyan Moon lunged at her in an attempt to grab and neutralize her. However, she gracefully retreated like a nimble cat, avoiding the blow. After that, Chin Hyena, for the first time in her long-suffering life, finally managed to defeat this arrogant guy by skillfully freezing him with her icy energy. Honestly, the girl still could not believe that she had achieved such an incredible victory. However, now she looked at herself in a completely new way. Ilmok did not even know what to say in such a situation, so he simply decided to go rest. After all, he clearly could not help resolve this conflict. However, the lady did not let him go, firmly grabbing his hand. She reminded him that she had just defeated her longtime sworn enemy. All that remained for the hero was to play along with her, rejoicing in the girl's incredible victory. And of course, to pretend that he had never doubted her inevitable victory for a second. This confident young man relied only on brute force. He needed a good shake-up. Honestly, the girl was wholeheartedly glad that Ilmok supported her with exactly that reaction. She expected nothing less from him. It seems that Chin Hyena had never been so happy since she began studying the demonic art of the bear claw. Her heart was about to burst from overwhelming happiness. And immediately after these words, the girl suddenly began coughing up blood. Although she did not know the exact cause, something seemed to mercilessly squeeze her heart. Apparently, emotions, frozen for a long time by demonic art, desperately tried to break out, thereby causing her unbearable pain. At that moment, the guards who understood nothing arrived. Apparently, all this noise attracted them here. Surely the guards should have known how to deal with the body's deviation from demonic art. However, Ilmok needed to somehow carefully explain to them what exactly happened in these chambers. At the very moment the guards approached closer, Chin Hyena herself threw herself into the hero's arms, hiding in his embrace. Ilmok immediately began to comfort the girl, begging her not to cry. Otherwise, she would only worsen her severe condition. The guards eavesdropping behind the wall awkwardly thought that perhaps they had worried unnecessarily and interfered in something that was not their business. In the end, the guards, with apologetic faces, bowed before the Lord for the immodest interference in personal matters and hurriedly left. Ilmok, of course, desperately asked them to return. After all, an unfortunate misunderstanding had occurred. However, they still hastily departed, so as not to disturb their intimate atmosphere, and Ilmok did not understand how to act in such a delicate situation. He would not be able to calm the girl alone. Moreover, the young man did not even know for sure whether the lady was indeed experiencing that very deviation from the demonic path. In the case of Sena and the older brother, everything was quite simple and obvious. The little girl showed signs of possession, and the older brother fell into a furious rage. When their minds calmed down, everything passed safely. Therefore, the same method should have worked with Chin Hyena. The problem was that the hero did not know which exact side effect had gotten out of control in the girl. The lady mentioned that the side effect of her martial arts was a complete loss of empathy. But this alone was clearly not enough to bring a person to such a severe state. This meant only one thing. The hero was clearly missing something important. At that moment, the girl herself obediently apologized for disturbing the hero. She promised that she would soon recover on her own, and asked Ilmak to forever forget her shameful behavior. The young man did not understand why she was so confident that she could handle this condition by herself. However, Chin Haina knew herself well as a person who does not give in to emotions. She simply needed to freeze her boiling feelings again using her art. If she did that, she would become herself again, the same cold and imperturbable person. However, Ilmak decisively ordered that the girl must not dare to freeze them. Finally, the hero understood what her true side effect was. Now her desire to suppress emotions had gotten out of control. This meant that the lady had to accept her feelings, jealousy, sadness, anger, without hiding anything. She had to overcome the side effect that desperately tried to mercilessly suppress all these feelings. Of course, the girl immediately panicked. After all, she could not accept these feelings. They made her a pathetic person, full of complexes and corrosive envy. Ilmak should not have said something like that to her. However, the hero perfectly understood. Her true side effect was precisely the suppression of emotions. The deviation of ki she encountered was the result of suppressed emotions reaching their absolute limit. Unable to withstand the monstrous pressure, they burst out. Ideally, the hero would help her stop suppressing emotions altogether. However, this would not work instantly. Therefore, Ilmak gently wiped her bloody tears, apologizing for expressing himself incorrectly. The young man suggested that instead of suppressing emotions, she completely get rid of them. After all, it was necessary to erase exactly those feelings she constantly suppressed. The hero asked that the girl not cling to these ugly emotions. She herself said, "If you live strictly by the rules, no problems will arise." All she needed was to completely empty her heart. Not to suppress, as she was used to, but instead to fully release them and be free. At that moment, Chin Haina plunged into the depths of her consciousness, where she wandered along a deserted street in the fog, not understanding anything that was happening. However, suddenly the girl came to a completely frozen house. These were her frozen emotions, which began to gradually awaken. The same envy, jealousy, complexes, sadness, and everything else that she desperately wanted to hide. It was precisely because the lady constantly tried to suppress these feelings that they continued to cause her unbearable pain. Therefore, now, on the wise advice of the young master, she tried to let everything go, instead of holding back. If nothing is suppressed, then no side effects should arise. The girl herself perfectly understood. She had no need to cling to these ugly feelings. If left alone, they would now disappear by themselves, dissolving into the void. However, unexpectedly, instead of inner peace, the lady found herself in the Pungamjian Palace. This was extremely strange, considering that she had hardly ever been in this palace. Perhaps the reason was that this hall simply meant a lot to her, although she herself did not realize it. The girl immediately recalled with anxiety that the yin energy of the demonic art of bare palms should fill her heart. And if she did not immediately drain her energy, she risked dying. Now, being in her inner space, she could not think about it, and return to the matter later. There was surely a reason why she ended up here. But it was not so important at the moment. At that moment, the girl actually began to meditate, gradually coming to herself. Finally awakening, Chin Haina sincerely thanked Ilmak, who had patiently guarded her all this time. However, he firmly refused these thanks. The lady's health was much more important now. Fortunately, her wounds had healed, and she was in much better shape than before. However, in this, the girl could only thank the young master. After all, it was he who told her story to the persistent Gaian moon. Ilmak hurried to explain that he had not deliberately revealed her secret. He was simply trying to ease the tense atmosphere between them. However, fortunately, the lady felt no resentment towards Ilmak. Now she no longer had any negative feelings towards Guyan Moon. Moreover, thanks to this incident, she even reached a new level of mastery. so she really had no reason to be angry. Then Ilmak decided to cautiously find out what they should do now with the young man. After all, they could not leave him in a frozen state like that. Therefore, the best solution was to place the young man in a secluded spot in the courtyard so that he would wake up on his own over time. When the young Sena saw the frozen Gaian moon, the little girl was very frightened, not understanding why her brother's servant was in such a strange state. However, Ilmak calmly explained that it was a kind of punishment for excessive talkativeness. At that moment, the elder brother, finally released from captivity, came to visit the younger one. Ilmak immediately congratulated the first student on reaching enlightenment and breaking through to a new level. Just then, Vijin Hawk came to the hero right after finishing his seclusion. He also wanted to apologize to Sena, whom he had been rude to, and thank his younger brother. Honestly, Ilmak was surprised, still not understanding the true reason for the gratitude. It turned out that the guy was still drowning in his own destructive rage. The reason he was able to overcome this insurmountable wall lay in the advice given to him by the hero. Therefore, the first disciple came to personally express his deep gratitude to his younger brother. Moreover, Vijin Hawk also realized that the best strategist for someone like him was precisely his younger brother. Honestly, the hero had some kind of bad premonition, and in the end, it was completely justified. Of course, Ilmak desperately tried to explain that he was still a novice who had not even finished the academy yet. This was too responsible a role for him. However, his elder brother did not rush him, magnanimously allowing the younger to fully concentrate on his studies at the academy. In that time, the first disciple will become a person worthy of having Ilmak serve him. In the end, the hero suggested postponing this serious conversation because he first wanted to clarify one curious point. Together with the elder brother came two more brothers, along with Mr. Khan. The elder brother was not related to their arrival, since each of them came to the hero for their own reason. It turned out that the master entrusted the elder brother with the arrangement of the academy. Thanks to this, Mr. Khan now worked under his command, and he came here to personally thank the hero. Vinpen said that he had advanced in martial arts thanks to Ilmak, so he joined because he also wanted to thank the hero. The sixth brother came here because he saw the two brothers going here, and also tagged along out of idle curiosity. So in other words, the purpose of his visit was not so noble. He was simply bored and came here out of nothing to do. In the end, the hero respectfully greeted the elder brothers one by one with a polite smile, desperately trying to hide how much he wished they would all disappear, and he would be left alone only with the younger sister. However, out of duty, Ilmak immediately began to praise the third brother, congratulating him on his breakthrough. However, a disturbing impression formed that the sixth brother was not feeling very well. However, he calmly explained that when he was alone in the rooms, he often saw terrible illusions and heard voices, but when he was among 11 people, he felt significantly calmer. Obviously, there were far fewer than 11 present here, so the hero anxiously realized the sixth brother's schizophrenia was rapidly progressing. No matter how much Ilmak counted even the most distant people, there were only 7 here in total. That same night, So Vinpen desperately tried to fall asleep. However, instead, intrusive thoughts kept entering his tortured mind. No matter how much he thought, Ilmak's congratulations on reaching the new level felt somewhat weak and insincere. Of course, the third brother was shy to admit it. However, the hero's attention was still focused on the eldest and sixth brothers. Therefore, there was an oppressive feeling that Ilmak had forced this reaction out of himself, but in reality, he was not happy for him. If so, then perhaps, in his soul, he mocked the third brother, believing that he could not be proud of his miserable results. But So Vinpen still could not be absolutely sure of this. So he tried to convince himself that it was not worth making hasty conclusions. But in such an anxious state, he could not fall asleep. Therefore, the best solution was to go straight to the younger brother in order to find out everything from him. The third brother decided to sneak in as quietly as last time, remaining unnoticed. If the younger brother is asleep, So Vinpen will simply wait until he wakes up. However, unexpectedly, he noticed a silhouette wandering around the room. Obviously, The guy thought that it might have been the personal maid of the younger brother. He even heard that she made a breakthrough thanks to Ilmok. Moreover, today there was some strange, intimate atmosphere between them. So Winpen decided not to intervene for now, generously allowing them to be alone. However, So Winpen very quickly realized that he had hoped in vain that she was just some ordinary maid. Therefore, when the mysterious stranger approached the younger brother, the third disciple immediately, lightning fast, pointed his blade at his face. After all, as is known, tracking a target in pitch darkness is a basic skill for his assassin class. He had already seen enough suspicious individuals among those who served the younger brother. However, the guy wanted to know who this audacious person was, so relaxed in the hero's chambers in the middle of the night. So Winpen shouted threateningly, demanding an explanation for the intrusion and the reason for his arrival. However, Ilmok hastily stopped the third brother, carefully explaining that this man was well known to him, after which the hero wearily rubbed his head, trying to regain composure. The young man perfectly understood why So Winpen was here. However, it remained a mystery to him what the finally thawed Gaian Moon was doing here. At that moment, an anxious voice of Chin Hina was heard behind the door, not understanding what was happening. Therefore, Ilmok hurried to justify himself, saying he was simply talking with the third brother and she had nothing to worry about. However, the girl felt that she clearly heard Gaian Moon's voice inside the chambers. Therefore, Ilmok lied, assuring her that she imagined it. They were just having a normal men's conversation. In the end, calmed down, the lady left, and the hero finally breathed a sigh of relief. After which, Ilmok introduced his assistant, Gaian Moon, from the Ghost Clan, to the third brother, who helped the wounded lady Chin Hina take care of everything. Perhaps the guy today, when he came to them, saw the ice statue on the training ground. This ice statue was actually the frozen Gaian Moon. And indeed, when So Winpen looked at him closely, he realized that they looked very similar. So, finally calming down, the third brother hid his sword. However, he was extremely curious about how the guy ended up frozen, so Gaian Moon had to explain in detail everything that had happened. By morning, So Winpen understood. A truly dramatic story had unfolded among them all. However, this still did not explain why Gaian Moon appeared in the younger brother's chambers at such a late hour. At that moment, the guy presented the hero with a letter, sadly explaining that he no longer wished to serve the young master. He had only brought upon himself the hatred of Chin Hina and failed to properly protect the young heir. Gaian Moon could not do what he wanted, but only what he was capable of. So he considered himself simply useless in everything. Ilmok was struck by the fact that the guy wrote a resignation request, even though he had not been officially accepted into service. Apparently, a broken heart hit the young man much harder than the hero expected. Therefore, he literally wept, begging to be allowed to leave. However, So Winpen suddenly thought that it was not Gaian Moon who deserved forgiveness, but rather himself. Honestly, it remained a mystery to the hero why the third brother was now behaving so depressively. Then So Winpen admitted that many praised his achievements in martial arts, but he could not accept these sincere compliments. At night, he felt that everyone secretly mocked him. So today he came to the younger one to directly ask what people really had in mind. Ilmok did not even believe that the third brother thought about such a thing. After all, during the day he was cheerful and carefree, but now he was immersed in gloomy thoughts. Therefore, So Winpen believed that a person like him, with such a rotten heart, truly did not deserve forgiveness. However, Gaian Moon could argue with the third lord. After all, he simply underestimated his incredible technique of 14 merciless strikes. Just at the sight of the sharp tip of his sword, the boy literally trembled with fear. And he said this absolutely sincerely, not to flatter. With Winpen understood, Gaian Moon definitely had to be strong enough to withstand this technique. Suddenly a brilliant idea came to the hero's mind. These two could fight in an honest duel. Gaian Moon could usefully learn from the senior student, and So Winpen could better understand the juniors by crossing swords with them. And indeed, everyone in the demonic cult knew there was no better way to understand a person than through battle. However, Gaian Moon believed that such an unworthy loser like him did not dare to ask the third brother for such an honor. However, Ilmok hastened to reassure Gaian Moon he was far from hopeless, just a little off the true path. In the end, Ms. Chin Hena herself said that she felt no negativity towards him. Moreover, the girl even thanked the hero for telling Gaian Moon her secret. Therefore, Ilmok asked so that the boy would not fixate on one person and would look at the world a little wider. Of course, the hero decided to accept his resignation, hoping that the young man would find a better path for himself. Gaian Moon was immensely grateful to the young master for his warm guidance and invaluable help. He solemnly promised that he would take this advice with deep respect and slowly find his true path. And then he would definitely win the heart of Chin Hena. Obviously, this was not at all what the master was aiming for, since the hero straightforwardly asked the assistant to abandon this hopeless venture. However, he really was a hopeless romantic. The next day, the hero spent time with little Sena. Finally, they said goodbye, and the little girl went to her palace. Fortunately, after Gaian Moon left, the atmosphere became much calmer. Initially, Ilmok was worried that the third brother might accidentally kill the boy, but since Gaian Moon was still alive in the morning after his visit, it was a good sign. In any case, now it was time to prepare for a full-scale breakthrough. The hero needed to forget about all these useless problems. After all, he had his own goals. Ilmok needed to become serious again and fully concentrate. However, unexpectedly, the teacher came to the hero, carrying a small box with a precious demonic explosive pill that the man had promised him. As is known, the hero's Dantian was still small, so the young man had to fully absorb the energy of this pill. And the teacher would help him remove the restriction and properly direct this powerful energy. Of course, usually Ilmok would not so recklessly take such doping. However, there are situations when common sense is not enough, and one has to endure. Moreover, the hero was currently most lacking internal energy. He just needs to swallow this pill, and the place at the Academy of Demonic Arts is in his pocket. In the end, placing his hands on the hero's shoulders, the teacher asked him not to open his mouth and to follow the flow of true Qi that would be directed to him. The most important thing in this process is not to lose consciousness. Very soon, the guy understood what it was about, for he felt a pain never before experienced. He felt the unrestrained energy of the explosive demonic pill raging. His meridians seemed to be torn apart by how strong and indomitable this energy was. However, suddenly, the young man realized the energy of the pill was cleansing all the dirt that clogged his meridians. Naturally, it was unbearably painful when something that was part of your body was forcibly torn out of it. But now, if he can endure this torment, his main meridians will become much wider and more perfect. Finally, the hero completed the large circle of meridians and began to feel slight relief. Now he only had to direct the remaining energy into his Dantian. However, unexpectedly, Ilmok felt such a monstrous explosion of energy that his body almost convulsed.